The cold September of 1620 arrived, bringing with it an alarming premonition of impending changes. The Palatinate territory located in the southwest of the powerful Holy Roman Empire was preparing for the upcoming trials of wartime. A group of unknown men walked purposefully along a winding road towards a remote fortified settlement in the hills. The gleam of metal weapons in their calloused hands clearly indicated that these were experienced warriors. The size of this military detachment truly amazed the imagination of any observer who happened to witness the spectacle in the area. Isaac walked confidently at the head of this entire impressive group of armed men heading towards an unknown goal. All around one could easily see the traces of destruction left behind by the recent violent military clashes in these parts. Among all this chaos and destruction, the destroyed scarecrow abandoned in the middle of the field looked especially sad. Numerous wounds and injuries befell him quite suddenly, as eyewitnesses of the tragic events that took place here recounted. Not far from an old spreading tree, a strange man was sitting all alone, deep in thought. Upon closer inspection, it became quite obvious that it was a young girl lost in her thoughts. Then she instinctively reached for her pectoral cross, seeking solace in faith during these difficult trials. The girl spoke bitterly of her faith in divine grace, but every year the summer became colder and the wheat did not ripen. All these unfavorable circumstances and constant deprivations clearly led the young woman into a state of deep frustration and despair. Despite her depressed mood, she stubbornly continued to sit under the shade of this old mighty tree. With hope in her voice, she wondered if the legendary promised land really existed and if they would be able to reach it. Suddenly, some unfamiliar people began to approach her, disturbing the relative silence and peace that reigned here. It turned out that they were two adult men with ill intentions slowly approaching a lonely girl under a tree. The young woman immediately felt a strong fear of these strangers who were approaching her threateningly with clearly hostile intentions. The attackers immediately began to rapidly approach their victim, causing the frightened girl to fall from the tree in panic. The first of the men cynically noted that in Mainz they would pay a pretty decent amount of money for such a beautiful girl. The second villain advised his accomplice to wait a little first, have some fun with the loot, and only then set off on the road. Naturally, the young girl began to desperately resist with all her might these two scoundrels who were trying to harm her. She tearfully begged the scoundrels to stop and not touch her as they began to roughly tear off her clothes. The terrified victim continued to desperately beg her tormentors to stop this outrage and leave her alone at last. Naturally, the cruel men were not going to stop and wanted only one thing: to satisfy their base animal instincts. Suddenly, someone who had been lying motionless on the ground until that moment was discovered near that very tree. The mysterious man slowly began to rise to his feet, drawing the attention of everyone present to his suddenly appearing figure. All the participants in this unpleasant scene simultaneously turned their gaze to him at the same moment in time. The attackers were extremely surprised and even shocked when they suddenly saw this unfamiliar man nearby. Isaac appeared before them silently and intently looking at the unfolding disgrace with his piercing eyes. One of the criminals asked with suspicion and bewilderment where this unknown stranger could have come from. Both scoundrels quickly rose to their feet and looked closely at the unexpectedly appearing witness of their criminal intentions. The frightened girl also looked with both anxiety and hope at the same time at this mysterious stranger who appeared as if out of nowhere. Isaac remained completely silent and continued to stare at all the participants in this disgusting scene with his cold eyes. The first of the men rudely and contemptuously called the man who had suddenly appeared a worthless bastard, trying to intimidate him. The aggressive criminal threateningly told the stranger not to interfere in their personal affairs while he was still in one piece. Isaac continued to look at the man threatening him with the stern and unyielding gaze of an experienced warrior. Then the enraged man resolutely rushed to attack Isaac, but he masterfully began to dodge his blows. Isaac easily dodged his opponent's clumsy attack, causing him to lose his balance and begin to fall helplessly. Immediately after this, Isaac delivered a powerful kick to the fallen man, completely incapacitating him. The second criminal screamed in horror that his accomplice was apparently dead or seriously injured. Isaac quickly drew his sharp combat weapon from its sheath, preparing to continue the inevitable fight with the enemy. He then skillfully repelled a desperate attack by the second attacker, demonstrating his superior mastery of the art of combat. All the men, and especially the frightened girl, were extremely amazed by the incredible skill of this mysterious unknown warrior. Isaac again cast his stern and unyielding gaze of an experienced fighter who had seen a lot on everyone present. The surviving attackers were completely stunned and horrified by what had just happened before their eyes. After just a few tense seconds, both surviving criminals began to flee in panic from the formidable warrior. The young girl could not understand who he was because not everyone is capable of moving so quickly. Isaac calmly asked the girl he had saved where exactly she was heading next in these troubled times. The girl gratefully replied that she and her grandfather were heading to the legendary Utopia, where they hoped to find a better life. Isaac curiously asked her what this mysterious place called Utopia was. The young woman explained hopefully that this was a special place where absolutely all people lived as equal brothers. Isaac remained thoughtfully silent, reflecting on the words he had heard about the just structure of society in a distant country. He seriously doubted whether such a just social structure could even be achieved in this cruel world. The girl noticed that he had quite a strong accent. He spoke in the Low German dialect, which is spoken mainly in the north of Germany. Suddenly, an elderly man approached them and addressed a girl named Zeta. It turned out that this gray-haired man was her beloved grandfather with whom they traveled through these dangerous lands. The grandfather anxiously asked if everything was okay. The girl replied that she was very scared, but the stranger helped her. The young man in that tense moment looked straight at the older man, assessing him as a potential ally. The grateful grandfather sincerely thanked the unknown warrior for the timely rescue of his beloved granddaughter from certain death. After these words of gratitude, the old man slowly reached into his worn pocket for something valuable. The grandfather kindly offered the savior some food and asked him to accept these modest gifts as a sign of sincere gratitude. However, Isaac politely but firmly refused the offered treat, silently shaking his head in denial. Then he silently walked up to the tree and began to reach down, after which he picked up some tattered flag. Immediately after this, Isaac, without further ado, began to calmly move away from these people who were grateful to him. The grandfather and the girl simply looked silently at the retreating figure of their mysterious savior with a feeling of deep gratitude. Isaac, without any parting words or gestures, continued to slowly walk away along the winding road in an unknown direction. Zeta curiously asked her grandfather where he thought this mysterious young man was from. The old man replied that he was neither a Tatar nor a Turk, as his grandfather had told him, and that their savior looked completely different. The young girl looked at her wise grandfather with surprise and bewilderment, expecting further explanations from him. Meanwhile, the main character continued to slowly walk away along the dusty road, leaving behind the people he had saved. Meanwhile, the girl and her caring grandfather began to get ready for the journey, heading towards the intended destination of the journey. She asked anxiously whether the Protestants would really be given safe refuge in the Palatinate, and the man confidently answered in the affirmative. The grandfather assured his granddaughter that he was an experienced blacksmith and that shoeing horses was his successful craft, which was highly valued. After some time, the travelers finally approached the very place that was the goal of their long journey. By that time, it was already late evening, painting the sky in the crimson tones of the setting sun. In the fortified city, as always in the evening, it was quite noisy from the voices of people and the sounds of crafts. The elderly man and the girl humbly knelt before the city gates at this crucial moment in their lives. A menacing man in iron armor sternly asked whether the blacksmith was really a Protestant who had fled from Catholic Bavaria. He warned gloomily that a large and formidable Spanish army would soon arrive here under the command of an experienced commander. Even the powerful fortress walls built by the best masters of fortification art will not save us from the attack of this army. Nevertheless, he graciously allowed the refugees to remain in the city until the arrival of enemy troops in these parts. After saying these words, the stern man in armor turned around and began to slowly walk away from the city gates. Zeta began to ask in fear what they should do, and her grandfather replied that they had left the Bavarian Catholics and were now back to the Spaniards. The frightened girl hugged the old man tightly and confessed to him that she was very scared in this uncertain situation. The grandfather began to calm his granddaughter, explaining that they were not the only ones who had taken refuge here from persecution and military action. This means that other reasonable people also consider this fortified place to be safe enough for temporary residence during wartime. At this moment, they began to look around, carefully studying the situation in the fortified city, which was new to them. Armed guards stood motionless at their posts and vigilantly guarded the powerful walls of the fortress from possible enemies. Suddenly, one of the guards shouted loudly an order for the city gates to be closed immediately for the night for safety. The commander of the fortress, in shining armor, sedately entered the fortification to personally supervise the defensive measures. He was immediately informed that someone was approaching the fortress, and the man ordered his subordinate to immediately report the details. The puzzled guard honestly admitted to his commander that he had absolutely no idea what was going on outside. The guard reported that only one person was approaching and was carrying in his hands some unfamiliar flag of an unknown state. The commander decisively ordered several warriors to immediately go to meet this mysterious stranger to clarify the circumstances. Then a group of armed guards hurried outside the fortress walls to meet the mysterious traveler. Meanwhile, the main character slowly approached the fortified city carrying the flag of his distant homeland in his hands. Noticing armed men approaching him, he suddenly stopped and prepared himself for a possible explanation of his intentions. The commander of the guards shouted loudly to his subordinates that they should under no circumstances shoot at this lone traveler. He immediately recognized the distinctive colors and symbols of the Dutch flag carried by the unknown man. The officer politely but firmly demanded that the stranger immediately identify himself and explain the purpose of his arrival. The protagonist politely introduced himself as Isaac from the distant Netherlands who had arrived here on a specific military mission. The man noticed with obvious surprise that this Dutchman spoke German fluently without the slightest difficulty. By this time it was already deep night, and all the people who had gathered entered the securely fortified city. In a candlelit room, an important man was carefully reading an urgent letter that had been received by courier. The girl understood from the conversation that this was an influential person who had arrived here on important business from the Bohemian Road. The respectable man continued to study with concentration the contents of the important letter he had received from high-ranking persons. He solemnly announced that his name was Henry, the brother of the powerful Elector Palatine Frederick V. So he came from a city besieged by the enemy where the heir to the throne had been sent but where the rest of the defenders were. The protagonist answered honestly that when they left the territory of the Netherlands their detachment numbered 100 experienced warriors. However, upon hearing the terrifying news of a Spanish army of 9,000 battle-hardened warriors, everyone fled. The man standing behind him laughed scornfully and dismissively called them all completely useless, cowardly freaks. Zeta listened attentively to their serious conversation about military affairs, trying to understand the essence of the terrible events happening around them. The girl noted with surprise that he was Dutch, but he was wearing rather strange and unusual clothes. The serious man asked him curiously why he alone remained faithful to his duty. The protagonist frankly answered that he was looking for just retribution because one man killed his master and disappeared. He swore to deal with the murderer with his own hands and return what he had stolen, for which he had come all this long way. The man asked if he knew where to look for the thief. The main character replied that most likely he landed with the Spaniards. The interlocutor nodded understandingly and noted that now everything was clear. He would stay here for no more than a month. The protagonist replied that he did not know whether in the West there was a concept of a sense of duty which was so important for a warrior. But this concept is akin to a spiritual vow and must be fulfilled despite any obstacles and dangers. He was sent from the Netherlands as an experienced mercenary. He will fight honestly according to the terms of his important mission. Even if they consider him an ordinary fighter bound by contract, it is still commendable that he was not afraid of danger. Having solemnly pronounced these words, the man handed him an important letter with official instructions and powers. The protagonist carefully began to hide the valuable document in a special leather case for important papers. At this late hour, the full moon shone especially brightly in the dark sky, illuminating the sleeping city with a silvery light. The vigilant guards continued to stand guard, protecting the peaceful sleep of the residents within the fortress walls. The main character carefully packed all his few personal belongings and prepared for a night's rest. He stood quietly and changed into more comfortable clothes in that quiet moment before bed. Zeta approached him cautiously, wanting to thank her savior once again for the help he had provided. Isaac immediately noticed the girl approaching him and looked at her questioningly. The young girl sincerely thanked him when she came closer for saving her from certain death today. The main character did not respond to her words of gratitude, but simply lay down silently on the prepared resting place. The girl looked at this mysterious and taciturn man from a distant country with bewilderment and curiosity. She looked closely at his battle weapon and flag, noticing that the hilt of the sword was made of strong steel. Then she asked curiously whether the flagpole was made of ordinary wood as is customary. The main character strictly told her not to touch this thing that was dear to his heart under any circumstances. The frightened girl recoiled and looked with alarm at the suddenly angry man, not understanding the reasons for his reaction. The main character immediately apologized and gently explained that this thing was very dear to him since it was made of bamboo. She found this extremely interesting and wondered if there was much of this amazing material growing in Japan. The girl politely introduced herself by name and curiously asked where exactly his mysterious home country was. Zeta also asked if his distant homeland was a good and prosperous place for people to live. The main character sadly replied that his state had been tormented by civil wars for a whole century and had long ceased to be peaceful. However, it was there that his native home was located where he spent the best years of his life. After these words, the main character looked thoughtfully at the girl who was interested in him, thinking about something of his own. He honestly admitted that he had no idea where to look for Japan on European maps of the world. The girl noticed that his eyes were rather narrow, as if they had been cut with a sharp knife by an experienced craftsman. The main character calmly noted that today there was a full moon in the sky, foreshadowing a change in the weather. The girl agreed that it was true, but it would be cloudy at night. It was autumn now, and the wind was blowing from the east. The protagonist was surprised to ask how she could so accurately predict changes in the weather in the area. Isaac asked if she knew Batavia 5 full lunar cycles had passed during his long journey. Zeta honestly admitted that she had never heard of a place with such a name in her life. The main character said that one way or another he spent a whole year of his life in that distant city. The journey to the Netherlands from those distant lands took him exactly 10 full lunar months of continuous travel. The girl could not understand or imagine whether Japan was really so far from their homeland. After fleeing Catholic Bavaria, he and his grandfather walked along dangerous roads for 13 days straight. And now it suddenly turned out that, instead of the safe Palatinate, they had to look for another reliable shelter from the war. The protagonist wearily noted that it was already quite late, and it was time for everyone to go to a well-deserved night's rest. A large Spanish army under the command of an experienced commander will appear here very soon, perhaps as early as tomorrow morning. He admitted that he had seen her advance troops yesterday and advised the girl to go to bed quickly. Zeta was greatly alarmed by the warning he had just given her about the approaching danger. With these anxious words about the upcoming trials, their long night conversation under the stars ended. A new morning arrived, bringing with it alarming forebodings about the coming serious trials for the defenders of the fortress. The mighty fortress stood silently in the morning silence, and not a single living soul was visible on the streets. Near the main gate one could easily notice a large wooden sign with important information for travelers. This sign clearly indicated in which direction the location of this fortress should be sought. The vigilant guards, as always in the morning, stood motionless at their responsible guard posts. Suddenly, with great surprise and even horror, they began to stare at something that appeared in the distance. Directly ahead on the horizon, the guards saw with horror a large enemy army approaching in battle formation. The guards immediately began to shout loudly that this was the formidable Spanish army they were already here and preparing to storm. One of the defenders of the fortress said with gloomy relief that the long-awaited moment of the decisive battle had finally arrived. The guards immediately hurried inside the fortress to immediately report this terrible news to their commander. The officer reported that these were the demons of the siege, the mercenary army of the famous Commander Spinola, who was terrifying all of Europe. At this critical moment, high-ranking men were carefully watching the approach of the enemy army from the fortress walls. The second commander also stood nearby and closely watched the movements of the Spanish troops in the valley below. He solemnly declared that the long-awaited time of the decisive battle had finally come for the defenders of this stronghold. The commander immediately jumped out and began giving orders to strengthen the gates and set up guns in combat positions. Experienced warriors immediately began to quickly and clearly carry out his urgent orders to prepare for defense. The defenders of the fortress prepared all the combat weapons they had at their disposal. At that moment of anxiety, Zeta and her grandfather were together somewhere in a safe place inside the fortress walls. The protagonist from his observation post closely watched all these feverish preparations for the upcoming battle. Isaac slowly began to draw his sharp battle sword from its sheath, preparing to take part in the battle. The military leader seriously asked him if he was ready to fight against a large and experienced enemy army. The officer added that he had heard that a Japanese warrior with a sword in his hands was considered an absolutely invincible enemy. The protagonist replied that in the Netherlands everyone says that Spinola is a great commander, and asked to what extent this corresponds to reality. The man replied that he had captured the impregnable Liege fortress, the most powerful stronghold in Flanders, in just 3 days of siege. Isaac was surprised to ask how this commander had managed to accomplish such an incredible military feat. The interlocutor explained that in truth Spinola is a rich Italian aristocrat and thousands of experienced soldiers gather under his banner. He signed a lucrative agreement with powerful Spain and received the right to independently recruit and train professional fighters. The main source of his military strength is his loyal people ready to fight for their commander to the last drop of blood. Despite the existing animosity between them, he sincerely respects Spinola as an outstanding and talented military leader of his time. Isaac added that there were persistent rumors that his mercenaries had not been paid for the past 6 months in a row. However, they continue to fight loyally for their commander. That is the true strength of his army. The warrior confessed that yesterday he had accidentally seen a village through which Spanish troops had recently passed in marching order. Surprisingly, this village was not even looted or burned as is usually done by passing troops. The man noted that Spanish soldiers care about their military reputation and try to maintain iron discipline among the rank and file. How could he resist such a strong, organized, and impeccably disciplined enemy army under the command of an experienced commander? Isaac admitted thoughtfully that he had thought about this serious opponent for a long time before going to bed, analyzing his tactical capabilities. After these important words, the main character decisively turned around and began to slowly walk away to his combat post. The man finally asked curiously whether he had managed to find an answer to the question that had been tormenting him about his enemy. Isaac made no answer to this question and continued to walk away, silently immersed in his serious thoughts. After some time, all the defenders of the fortress were on the high walls above, preparing for the upcoming battle with the enemy. The warriors carefully watched the entire numerous enemy army lined up in battle formation right in front of the fortress walls. The formidable army of Spanish opponents also stood motionless in their positions, awaiting the signal to begin the decisive assault. The disciplined Spanish soldiers patiently awaited the long-awaited order from their renowned commander to begin the attack on the fortress. Each of the experienced warriors knew perfectly well why exactly they came here and what important task they had to complete. All the soldiers eagerly awaited the decisive order from their legendary commander to begin the assault on the enemy stronghold. Meanwhile, the Spaniards also carefully prepared all the necessary livestock to participate in the upcoming fierce battle for the fortress. Experienced soldiers skillfully harnessed all the animals to use them to transport siege equipment during the battle. Absolutely all combat weapons were raised and brought to full combat readiness for the upcoming decisive assault. The defenders of the fortress were clearly very frightened by the sight of this numerous and menacing-looking enemy army below. One man said in despair that if only they had reinforcements of at least 100 experienced warriors. And this mysterious Asian, in his opinion, will be of no use in the upcoming fierce battle. Isaac at this critical moment simply stood calmly and carefully watched the military preparations taking place around him. The man began to speak bitterly about the fact that the impregnable castle of Wolfsburg had fallen and his brother in Bohemia would be isolated. He resolutely stated that he wanted to defend this strategically important place at any cost, even at the cost of his own life. His interlocutor remained thoughtfully silent at this difficult moment, understanding the seriousness of the critical military situation that had developed. Suddenly, right in front of the main gates of the fortress, a lone enemy messenger appeared with a white flag in his hands. All the defenders of the fortress immediately noticed this man and paid close attention to him, wondering about his intentions. The uncle said that he would go to negotiate, but the man replied that he should let him handle the matter himself. The massive fortress gates slowly began to open, allowing a representative of the defenders to enter to negotiate with the enemy envoy. The young man resolutely went to meet the enemy messenger to find out the terms of a possible capitulation or truce. Sometime after the start of negotiations, it became clear what conditions the Spanish army command was offering. The Spanish envoy introduced himself as Roberto Diaz, an experienced knight serving under the direct command of the famous General Spinola. In the event of the voluntary surrender of the fortress, he solemnly guarantees complete safety to all civilians and defenders of the stronghold. The boy proudly replied that he would never kneel before the Spanish royal banner. It was at this tense moment that he demonstratively thrust his combat weapon deep into the ground in front of the enemy messenger. The Spanish knight only smiled contemptuously and looked calmly at this young and hot defender of the fortress. After that, he stuck his own weapon into the ground next to his opponent's sword in exactly the same way. Naturally, this ancient ritual marked the official beginning of a fierce battle between the two opposing sides with no possibility of retreat. After the formal negotiations were completed, both representatives began to slowly travel back to their troops to prepare for battle. The Spanish knight returned with dignity to his comrades to report to the command on the results of the diplomatic mission. The military musicians immediately began playing the war drums, signaling to the entire army that the assault was about to begin. Absolutely all soldiers on both sides began to actively prepare for the start of the decisive battle for possession of the strategically important fortress. The legendary commander Spinola on his war horse slowly began to advance forward in front of his numerous troops. The luxurious armor on his noble warhorse was decorated with real gold sparkling in the rays of the sun. All of his own heavy battle armor was also skillfully forged from precious gold by the finest craftsmen in Europe. The renowned military leader looked confidently and contemptuously at his future opponents, assessing their combat capabilities and determination. One of his closest assistants approached him on horseback, ready to receive final orders before the assault began. The adjutant respectfully reported to his commander that all troops were in full combat readiness and awaiting his orders. Spinola raised his right hand in a solemn gesture at that historic moment, preparing to give the signal to attack. Absolutely everyone present understood perfectly well that right now the decisive moment had arrived for the beginning of a fierce battle for the fortress. The soldiers of both opposing armies were preparing tensely for the upcoming bloody battle on which their fate depended. Powerful siege guns were aimed precisely at the walls and gates of the enemy fortress to inflict maximum damage. The warhorses were fully prepared to rush forward at the signal from their riders towards the enemy positions. Absolutely all participants in this grand battle waited with bated breath for the start of this historically important battle. The legendary commander continued to hold his right hand raised up, creating tension before the decisive moment of the attack. Spinola looked at his opponents carefully and appraisingly, analyzing their defensive capabilities and weaknesses. Thousands of people on both sides waited tensely for the battle to begin, which would determine the fate of this strategically important fortress. All noble knights were morally ready to give their lives for the honor of their banner and the fulfillment of their military duty. Suddenly, at this critical moment, the massive fortress gates began to slowly open again to let someone inside. The young negotiator then quickly rode inside the fortress on horseback, completing his diplomatic mission to the enemy. The heavy fortress gates closed behind him with a bang, finally cutting off the possibility of a peaceful resolution to the military conflict. Immediately after this, Spinola decisively lowered his raised hand and gave the long-awaited order for the artillery to open fire. At this historic moment, absolutely all Spanish cannons simultaneously fired sharply at the enemy fortress with a deafening roar. The powerful siege guns fired almost simultaneously immediately after this decisive order from their legendary commander to attack. People nearby instinctively covered their ears with their hands, seeing how deafeningly loud these weapons of war were firing. The gunners immediately began loading the next guns with special shells to fire a second salvo at the fortress walls. The siege guns, strangely enough, continued to fire methodically, one after another, maintaining a continuous artillery barrage. All the heavy shells fired flew with a howl straight towards the fortress, bringing death and destruction to its defenders. After a few tense seconds of flight, these deadly projectiles were supposed to reach their target and explode inside. Then simultaneously unbearably strong explosions occurred throughout the entire fortress, shaking the ground and destroying buildings. Naturally, this powerful blast wave immediately threw several unsuspecting people far back from the epicenter. The deafening explosions did not stop for a single minute, methodically destroying the fortress walls and internal buildings of the stronghold. One of the defenders even received a direct hit from a heavy artillery shell, leaving no chance for salvation. Naturally, after such a direct hit from a powerful shell, the unfortunate man was instantly torn into small bloody pieces. The terrible explosions continued without stopping, turning the once impregnable fortress into a pile of smoking ruins and debris. Heavy artillery shells fell one after another directly into the fortress, destroying everything in their deadly path. Right inside the fortress walls, these shells exploded with a deafening roar, killing people and destroying defensive structures. The powerful salvo from numerous siege guns continued without interruption, methodically destroying the stronghold stone by stone. The continuous volley of Spanish cannons did not stop for a single second, creating a real hell inside the fortress walls. In just 1 minute of intense shelling, half of the once powerful fortress was completely destroyed by enemy artillery fire. Inside the crumbling fortress, civilians and soldiers began to suffer unbearably from this merciless artillery shelling. At this critical moment, Isaac selflessly began to save Zeta and her grandfather from mortal danger. The young man at that moment was trying to take shelter with his uncle from this deadly artillery attack of the enemy. It was at this critical moment that his uncle suddenly jumped to his feet, trying to assess the extent of the destruction that had been caused. At that very moment, another heavy artillery shell flew with a howl right at the place where they were. One of the men nearby was completely burned to ashes by a direct hit from an explosive shell. The Spanish guns finally stopped firing at this point, giving respite to the exhausted defenders of the half-ruined fortress. The intense artillery fire suddenly stopped for a few seconds, allowing people to catch their breath after this nightmare. Absolutely all the survivors began to breathe heavily after this terrible artillery shelling, trying to come to their senses. Some of the frightened defenders began to immediately flee the battlefield, unable to withstand the psychological pressure of what was happening. The people inside the half-ruined fortress were, of course, in a state of complete panic from such a destructive impact of enemy artillery. Many wounded and shell-shocked people desperately called for help, hoping to receive medical assistance from their comrades. Heavy, unexploded shells from Spanish cannons lay right on the territory of the fortress among the rubble of destroyed buildings. The girl began to cry bitterly from horror. The grandfather begged her not to cry, promising that he would protect his granddaughter. Isaac looked ahead with a stern expression, confidently assessing the situation and planning his next steps. It seemed as if the Spanish cannons temporarily stopped firing, and everything became relatively calm for a while. Naturally, the defenders of the fortress suffered an unbearable number of irreparable losses after this devastating artillery bombardment. One of the commanders at this critical moment struggled to his feet amid the smoke and debris. He slowly looked straight up at the sky, thanking fate for being alive after this hell. His nephew, to everyone's relief, was also alive and not seriously injured in the shelling. The young man looked tensely into the distance beyond the fortress walls, trying to discern the enemy's further intentions. He then anxiously informed those around him that numerous Spanish troops were beginning to move towards the ruined fortress. The man said in despair that may the Almighty Lord help them in this unequal battle against superior forces. Naturally, the fierce battle for possession of the fortress continued, moving into a new, even bloodier phase. Numerous Spanish infantry moved forward in orderly ranks to the half-ruined walls of the enemy fortress for an assault. The man and the boy looked at this grand spectacle with fear, realizing the hopelessness of their situation. None of the defenders understood exactly how many enemy soldiers were storming their stronghold. At this decisive moment, Isaac suddenly jumped out into a prominent place with a Dutch flag in his hands. He proudly held this flag of his distant homeland confidently in his raised hands. The man began to ask in bewilderment what exactly this mysterious Isaac was doing in the midst of the battle. Even the girl couldn't understand why he climbed up there with a flag instead of taking part in the defense. Zeta watched him carefully, trying to understand what exactly he was doing at this critical moment in the battle. The girl suggested that perhaps he was looking out for something or giving a signal to one of his accomplices. After this, the girl ran after him. The man desperately tried in every way to stop her from this reckless act. He shouted loudly at her to stop immediately and not expose herself to mortal danger on the battlefield. The Spanish commander solemnly ordered all his troops to immediately begin a decisive assault on the enemy fortress. Absolutely all soldiers were fully prepared to begin the attack, waiting only for the final signal from their commander. The military musicians began playing their instruments again, giving the entire army a battle signal to begin the assault. The war drums also began to play their menacing melody, inspiring the soldiers to perform a feat for the glory of the king. To the sounds of military music, the Spanish troops began to march in an organized manner towards the walls of the enemy fortress. After this, they pointed their sharp combat weapons straight ahead, preparing for hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. The soldiers realized that they would have to attack the fortifications literally in the next second, not sparing their own lives. All Spanish troops continued to move steadily forward towards their goal, despite the danger of meeting fierce resistance. The number of advancing soldiers was so great that thick dust rose rose up covering the battlefield. All those who were on the walls of the fortress were seized with horror at the sight of this advancing armada. One of the commanders resolutely raised his combat weapon high into the air, calling on the defenders to resist. There was no emotion visible on his stern face at this critical moment of mortal danger. The guy desperately shouted that the enemies were already approaching, let them keep them at a safe shooting distance. He shouted to his comrades not to be afraid of the superior enemy forces and to fight to the end. Let them at any cost not allow the numerous Spanish troops to penetrate inside the castle they are defending. At this tense moment, all the defenders of the stronghold began to take out their personal combat weapons for hand-to-hand combat. Absolutely all the soldiers were very frightened by the sight of this enemy army of many thousands advancing on them. One of them began to speak in despair that at this rate they would all be killed in this unequal battle. He called on his comrades to look at these huge siege towers slowly approaching the fortress walls. The man pointed his index finger towards the approaching siege fortifications, which were terrifying in their size. The defenders saw that the siege towers were indeed very tall and posed a serious threat to the defense. These formidable war machines moved slowly but steadily towards the walls of the fortress under the cover of infantry. The man began to shout that the goal was to destroy the walls and gates, and that everyone who distinguished themselves would be promised 5 gold coins. Naturally, ordinary soldiers were further motivated by such a generous reward for the bravery they showed in battle. The man said that he was not at all concerned about the costs. He was ready to pay 5 gold for each enemy head. 5 gold coins is a serious sum, and the soldiers will fight for it even more desperately without it. One of the warriors began to say that he would certainly not refuse such a generous reward for bravery. The commander resolutely ordered his men to move forward to meet the advancing enemy without wasting time. Naturally, the warriors began to rush into the attack after such an inspiring order from their commander. Their weapons of war were raised menacingly, ready to deal a fatal blow to any enemy they encountered. Experienced archers also raised their long-range weapons upward, taking aim at the advancing enemy soldiers. After this, they simultaneously fired a volley, releasing a cloud of deadly arrows towards the enemy. A real rain of sharp arrows covered the advancing Spanish army, inflicting its first casualties. Arrows literally pierced their leather and wooden shields, leaving no chance of protection from defeat. Naturally, many soldiers died instantly from direct hits from sharp arrows in vital organs. The guy worried that their maximum effective range was only 50 feet. Meanwhile, the Spanish warriors had come significantly closer to the walls of the fortress, preparing to begin a direct assault. Then they began to desperately break straight into the main gate, trying to break through this last barrier. The attackers are trying with all their might to break into the fortress regardless of their own losses in people. After this, the defenders immediately began to intensively fire at the attackers from all types of available weapons. The men above were busy methodically firing at the enemy soldiers who were trying to break through to the gate. Naturally, such defensive tactics began to bear fruit, inflicting serious losses on the enemy. Then the defenders again began to fire at the attackers from their few cannons that had survived the enemy shelling. Only at this moment the artillery fire was directed against the advancing Spanish soldiers and not the other way around. Naturally, this radical change in the situation helped the defenders in waging a defensive battle for their stronghold. From such precise shots, many enemy soldiers were blown to pieces with no chance of salvation. The advancing warriors were at a loss at this point due to the unexpected and effective resistance from the defenders. One of the Spanish commanders shouted loudly to his subordinates to immediately set up assault ladders. Immediately after this, the soldiers began to put up long wooden ladders to the walls of the fortress to climb up. After this, the Spanish warriors began to bravely climb up these stairs, risking their own lives. They tried in every possible way to move up them, overcoming the fierce resistance of the fortress defenders. The defenders continued to methodically fire at the attackers from above, preventing them from gaining a foothold on the walls. They did not allow many attackers to even get a little closer to the top of the fortress wall, throwing them down. Accordingly, thanks to such an effective defense, many of the attackers began to fall down from these high stairs. But there was also return fire from below from the Spanish archers supporting their comrades on the ladders. Naturally, this helped the attackers, and they hit each other less often thanks to the fire cover. The surviving comrades began to climb over the corpses of their fallen comrades, using them as steps to climb. It was a real battle to the death between two irreconcilable opponents for the fortress. Some of the attackers still managed to climb the fortress wall, but they were immediately met by the defenders. The young man also took an active and direct part in this fierce battle, fighting side by side with his comrades. His uncle also fought bravely at this critical moment, defending his native fortress from enemy invasion. Isaac, to everyone's surprise, simply stood calmly and watched the progress of the battle from his elevated position. The man insistently told him to immediately go down and take part in the defense of the fortress. Isaac calmly replied that the time was not yet right for him to intervene in the battle. Then he slowly turned back to see what was happening in other parts of the besieged fortress. Isaac noticed the girl approaching and asked in bewilderment why she had come to this dangerous place. She became extremely curious as to why this mysterious warrior was not taking an active part in the fierce battle. At that moment, she turned her close attention to something happening below the fortress walls. The girl saw with horror that below the walls there were indeed a lot of enemy warriors storming the stronghold. She then asked him with concern what he was doing there at all instead of taking part in the fight. Isaac replied briefly that he was carefully counting the number of enemy troops and analyzing the situation on the battlefield. The boy began to call the advancing Spanish soldiers despicable bastards, unworthy of mercy in this battle. The man desperately shouted to all the defenders that no one should retreat from their positions under any circumstances. This battle was truly brutal and bloody, sparing neither of the opposing sides. At that moment, one man began to fall from the high fortress walls, struck down by an enemy arrow. People who were trying to climb the assault ladders also began to fall down en masse under fire from the defenders. Naturally, it was all a fantastically dynamic and exciting spectacle of a mortal battle between two armies. The falling soldiers began to stumble upon the sharp combat weapons of their own comrades below. In 1 second, many warriors killed themselves with their own weapons, becoming victims of an absurd accident. It was a very cruel spectacle, demonstrating the ruthlessness and absurdity of the war going on around us. But the Spanish soldiers were fiercely motivated and continued to move forward towards their goal. Naturally, they did not abandon the crazy idea of breaking into the enemy fortress at any cost. The people inside the besieged fortress were fully prepared to meet the attackers and give them a worthy rebuff. They naturally prepared for hand-to-hand combat, understanding the inevitability of a breakthrough by some of the enemy through the defensive lines. The fierce battle continued despite everything, giving no respite to either side. The brave warriors were ready to stand to the very end and not surrender to the superior forces of the enemy. The fighting cattle remained in place, ready for use at the critical moment of the battle. The huge siege towers continued to move slowly but steadily forward towards the walls of the besieged fortress. As it turned out, inside these formidable war machines there were also well-armed Spanish warriors ready to storm. The warriors patiently waited for their right moment to quickly jump out of the ambush and attack the enemy. It was at that critical moment that one of the groups came up against the fortress walls as the massive gates began to slowly open. The defenders immediately began to run forward, using the surprise of the moment to break through the opening gates of the fortress. The Spanish soldiers in the besieged fortress were extremely surprised by such an unexpected and daring maneuver of the enemy. The defenders tried their best to provide their comrades with the opportunity to safely move forward through the dangerous area. Naturally, not all brave warriors managed to successfully overcome this deadly, dangerous path under enemy arrows. Despite the losses and danger, all the other defenders still stubbornly continued to run forward at a rapid pace. Many brave warriors died tragically at that very bloody moment under a hail of enemy arrows. Meanwhile, brave warriors quickly jumped out of other high defensive towers of the fortress to support the attack. All the defenders simultaneously began to fight fiercely right from above on the fortress walls against the Spanish invaders. The ongoing battle was a real bloody meat grinder with many casualties on both sides. The brave warriors of the fortress continued to relentlessly and fiercely attack the Spanish soldiers, giving them no respite. Then the defenders began to set fire to the fortress gates, which were securely covered with dry straw for protection. Zeta carefully noticed that the enemies were not entering the fortress and immediately reported this important observation. The young man shouted loudly that they had fought heroically and had not allowed the invaders to go any further. The Spanish soldiers called the brave defenders of the fortress rebellious Protestant heretics, worthy only of death and damnation. The invaders said with hatred that all the defenders of the fortress faithfully served the devil himself and his dark forces. Naturally, the opinions of the opposing sides differed radically on this fundamentally important religious and political issue. The Spanish commander stood calmly in a safe place and carefully watched the entire bloody battle that was taking place. The commander confidently told Roberto that the fortress would soon fall on its own, and during that time he could calmly drink a glass of wine. The experienced man said something indistinctly about the need to move forward to the walls of the fortress for a decisive assault. Roberto asked loudly if everyone had heard the order and demanded that the troops immediately move forward to the target. The war horses and their riders obediently began to slowly move forward in the direction of the besieged fortress. All the defenders on the walls immediately turned their attention to the approaching Spanish cavalry attack. The man who was watching what was happening was very surprised at that very tense and decisive moment. The young man looked in exactly the same way at this menacing and impressive spectacle of the approaching cavalry. The experienced man simply continued to stand motionless in his place and calmly watched the entire battle taking place. The girl slowly lowered her head down at that very anxious and tense moment of the events that were taking place. Isaac also continued to stand motionless at his observation post, closely following the development of military operations. The girl tried with all her might to look behind his broad back to get a better view of the unfolding intense battle. Zeta suddenly started screaming very loudly, as she was very scared by the bloody and brutal battle happening around her. The protagonist calmly said something important about the distance of 500 feet to the approaching enemy. Naturally, the excited girl did not understand what exactly he was talking about and asked him about it again in bewilderment. Isaac patiently explained that this was the exact distance which he had carefully calculated yesterday when he came here to scout. The experienced shooter then clarified that the distance to the approaching target was now 450 feet. After a while, Isaac recounted again and announced that the distance had decreased to 420 feet. Isaac politely asked the girl to help him and firmly hold the special flag in the correct position. Zeta didn't understand what exactly he was going to do with this strange bamboo tube of unknown purpose. Meanwhile, the main character carefully began to take out something important from a hidden hiding place inside the tube. The surprised girl suddenly discovered that the thing hidden inside was made of durable iron and metal. Isaac really started to masterfully transform an ordinary flag into a truly formidable ranged weapon with the help of hidden parts. The observing girl was very shocked and surprised by such an unexpected transformation of an ordinary flag into a weapon. Zeta couldn't believe that this ordinary-looking shaft actually hid a real weapon. The man watching what was happening was extremely surprised that it turned out to be a real European-style combat musket. Zeta was surprised to find that the assembled weapon was much lighter than she had originally expected. The young man was genuinely surprised by the fact that Isaac turned out to be an experienced and accurate shooter with a firearm. The Spanish man on horseback continued to move slowly forward towards the fortress walls, unaware of the danger. Isaac took stock of the situation and announced that the distance to the target was now exactly 380 feet. The experienced guy began to carefully load his deadly firearm with gunpowder and a lead bullet for the shot. He then carefully lit a special fuse that would ignite the gunpowder in the musket barrel. Isaac began to aim slowly and carefully at the approaching rider, choosing the best moment to shoot. The attentive girl noticed that the wind was blowing from the other direction and advised him to pay attention to the swaying of the grass. Isaac immediately turned his close attention to this important remark and began to take into account the direction of the wind. The shooter began to look closely at the swaying grass near the man he was about to shoot. Taking into account the wind direction, Isaac carefully aimed a little differently, making the necessary adjustments to his sight. The experienced guy quickly realized that he needed to aim slightly to the left of center to compensate for the wind drift of the bullet. The Spanish man continued to confidently move forward towards the fortress, not suspecting anything. The rider on the horse moved faster and faster, approaching the fortress walls for a decisive attack. The distance between the shooter and his target was reduced to the critical 350 feet for an accurate shot. Then Isaac took a deep breath, held it, and carefully pulled the trigger of his musket. The shot was followed by a deafeningly loud explosion that echoed throughout the surrounding area and the fortress. The lead bullet flew straight towards the unsuspecting Spanish man on his war horse. The Spanish commander continued to confidently move forward towards the fortress walls, not noticing the flying danger. The rider rode forward calmly, not suspecting anything bad and not expecting a sudden fatal blow. Isaac fired an accurate shot from his trusty musket, carefully aiming at the target moving across the field. All the people nearby immediately turned their close attention to the loud and unexpected shot that sounded. The young man was very impressed and surprised when he first saw the action of this formidable firearm. All witnesses present held their breath in anticipation of the outcome of this decisive and potentially fatal shot at the enemy. A deadly lead bullet began to rapidly approach the unsuspecting Spanish man on horseback. It was at that critical moment that a flying projectile struck the rider straight in the heart with deadly accuracy. Naturally, the mortally wounded adult man immediately fell from his war horse to the ground. Isaac hit his target absolutely perfectly from such a long distance, demonstrating outstanding marksmanship. Then the commander, struck in the heart, fell completely to the ground and remained lying motionless. Roberto was very surprised and shocked by the sudden death of his commander from an unknown enemy. The Spanish officer immediately ran quickly to his fallen commander to provide him with immediate assistance. But it was too late to do anything since the commander was dead from a shot to the heart. The shocked man began shouting loudly to the musicians to immediately sound the signal for a general retreat of the troops. The military musician immediately began to strictly carry out the order he received and give signals for retreat. All the Spanish troops heard the familiar sounds of retreat and immediately began an orderly retreat from the battlefield. The people on the fortress walls were very surprised by such a sudden turn of events in their favor. The powerful fortress of Wolfsburg was almost taken by the Spaniards, but the situation changed dramatically overnight thanks to a well-aimed shot. No one could understand what their commander was thinking when he ordered a retreat at the moment of imminent victory. Naturally, the ordinary Spanish soldiers did not realize that their commander had been killed by a sniper shot from a long distance. All witnesses of what was happening were very surprised by such an unexpected and dramatic turn of military events. The defenders of the fortress could not believe that they had managed to repel what seemed to be a hopeless enemy attack. Isaac continued to stand calmly on top of the fortress wall, observing the results of his accurate shot. The experienced marksman confidently continued to stand motionless in his position, holding the still smoking musket in his hands. No one present could believe that he had managed to hit the target accurately from such an incredibly long distance. The demoralized Spaniards began to hastily retreat from the battlefield, having lost their commander and fighting spirit. All the enemies literally began to run back quickly, escaping from possible pursuit and finishing off by the defenders. Everywhere there were cries that the troops were retreating in an organized manner and leaving the battlefield. Naturally, the defenders of the fortress began to actively finish off the retreating Spaniards at that very chaotic moment of flight. All the Spanish soldiers were in a great hurry to leave the danger zone at that critical moment of the retreat that had begun. The panicking warriors began to bump into each other and seriously interfere with each other in their disorderly retreat, creating additional danger. The fact that the soldiers were getting in each other's way greatly slowed down their organized retreat from the battlefield. The siege towers, under the influence of fire and destruction, suddenly began to break down and collapse dangerously. People who were unable to escape in time began to fall helplessly from the collapsing wooden structures. Naturally, they all died after such a high fall almost instantly from the severe injuries they received. The frightened fighting cattle were extremely agitated by the chaos that was taking place and began to rush around the battlefield. After this, the cattle, maddened by fear, literally began to simply trample the fallen people mercilessly. The enraged animals stepped directly on the heads of the helpless wounded, causing them additional fatal injuries and suffering. All the survivors tried by any means possible to calm their fighting animals who were maddened with fear. It was at that chaotic moment that the fortress archers became active and began methodically finishing people off from above with arrows. The bloody battle under the walls of the fortress finally came to its logical and predictable end. Hungry crows began to circle over the battlefield, literally devouring the bodies of the dead. There were a lot of black ravens at that very moment after the end of the bloody battle. Naturally, all the tired warriors were very exhausted after the long and intense battle for the fortress. The defeated Spanish army finally retreated from the battlefield, leaving behind many dead comrades. Isaac continued to stand calmly in his previous first place and carefully watched the results of the battle. Those around did not understand what kind of wonderful weapon it was whose firing range simply astounded the imagination. Admiring defenders said he was an excellent sniper whose shooting skills were to be envied. Isaac modestly said that it was all thanks to the girl, since without her advice about the wind, the bullet would have barely grazed the enemy's chest. Zeta asked with interest if she had really been of any use to him at that crucial moment in the battle. Isaac sincerely said that she helped him a lot in making an accurate shot, taking into account the wind direction. The girl was very surprised and happy when she heard these grateful words from the experienced shooter. Zeta thanked him and added that after all, he was the first to help her in a difficult moment. Isaac rightly replied that now she too had helped him at a critical moment in the battle. Zeta replied that in that case it was necessary to inform the other person about it for the sake of fairness. The young man replied that he was now in her debt for the help he had provided in the battle. The satisfied girl replied that it was great that they helped each other. One of the defenders began to slowly approach Isaac to get a better look at his amazing weapon. The curious man also looked at him attentively at that very moment of general admiration. The intrigued defender looked at the guy's unusual weapon with great interest, trying to understand its structure. He asked curiously where Isaac got this musket and who skillfully made it. Isaac replied that the weapon was made by his master, who lived in a distant city in the country of Japan. The interested guy replied that this meant that this was his exhaustive answer to the question asked about weapons. An army united around a charismatic commander cannot fight effectively without his leadership and command. One man single-handedly repelled a powerful attack by superior Spanish forces at the walls of the fortress. The observer asked why the hero then had such a gloomy and dissatisfied expression on his face. Isaac replied that his main target was not among these ordinary enemy soldiers. However, he is confident that the man he is looking for is hiding somewhere in Europe and he will find and shoot him. The worried boy looked at him with alarm, hearing these ominous words about revenge and murder. The surprised man also looked at Isaac in bewilderment, not understanding the motives of his personal vendetta. Zeta was no exception and looked at him in surprise, trying to understand his true intentions. After the defeat of the Osaka campaign and the war in Japan in 1614-15, much changed. Many Japanese samurai warriors fled overseas after their defeat, and Isaac in this story was one of them. Of course, all the defenders of the fortress joyfully celebrated their unexpected but well-deserved victory over the Spanish invaders. Around the same historical time, in addition to the Little Ice Age, the 30 Years' War turned Europe into ruins. To fulfill his personal mission, one Japanese warrior traveled all the way to the Holy Roman Empire to fight in the war. A new day had already dawned after the end of the bloody battle at the walls of the besieged fortress. Naturally, all the defenders immediately began to actively restore and rebuild the fortress damaged in the battle. All residents allocated the necessary funds and resources to qualitatively rebuild the destroyed fortress. Everyone also worked together to clean up and bury the numerous corpses of those killed in the battle. The appointed guards responsibly protected the restored fortress from possible new enemy attacks. The experienced man told the workers to hurry and first repair the damaged fortress gates. Everyone worked hard tirelessly to restore the defensive structures as quickly as possible. All residents helped each other to successfully complete the common important mission of restoring the fortress. Even the peaceful people who lived in the fortress actively helped the soldiers in this important work. Isaac meanwhile sat quietly to the side and did something important for his weapon. The shooter looked closely at his valuable weapon, which he held in his trained hands. As it turned out, he was carefully cleaning and servicing the musket at that very calm moment after the battle. Isaac carefully poured a special cleaning liquid onto a clean cloth for servicing weapons. He then used this soaked rag to carefully clean the inside of the barrel of his trusty firearm. The experienced warrior did all this very carefully and extremely accurately without rushing or being distracted. Isaac was completely focused on thoroughly cleaning his vital weapon after use. The delighted girl said that this was truly a magical weapon with amazing capabilities. An elderly grandfather sat down on his knees with interest at that very moment for a better observation. He said that it was simply impossible to comprehend that such a thin barrel could withstand the explosion of a huge amount of gunpowder. The curious old man asked with interest how the master had forged this amazing weapon. The girl proudly explained that her grandfather was an experienced blacksmith and was knowledgeable in metalworking. Isaac patiently explained that the craftsman used a special high-quality iron ore to make it. To make a high-quality barrel, it is necessary to use special pine coal of a certain grade. The metal bar is folded several times to achieve the required strength and flexibility. The workpiece is then carefully stretched and shaped using a special metal rod. The girl asked if he could make such a weapon himself, to which Isaac replied that it was beyond his powers. Isaac began to carefully fold and put away his cleaned and battle-ready weapons with concentration. The shooter finally completed all the necessary maintenance procedures for his musket. Isaac noted with warmth that this magnificent weapon was made by his late master with his own hands. The master used only high-quality iron and the right fire to create this masterpiece. The girl thought seriously about his words about the deceased master and the current situation. Isaac calmly replied that his master simply did not need any other materials for his work. The master forged the hot iron faster and more beautifully than anyone else in their lands. Zeta deeply understood that this was the true art of creating weapons from iron and fire. The elderly grandfather simply remained silent and attentive at that moment, pondering what he had heard. Isaac responded with pain that his master was brutally killed, and to avenge it, he became a professional mercenary and came here to Europe to find killers. The sympathetic girl sincerely said that she would help him in just retribution for the deceased master. The protagonist smiled gratefully and looked at her warmly for the support she offered. Meanwhile, someone said loudly that someone had just tried to secretly leave the fortress. The main character immediately turned his close attention to this suspicious incident. There was an adult man and a young guy there looking at each other tensely. The man firmly replied that he no longer owed anyone anything under the contract. All the defenders of the fortress present watched this tense and conflicting situation between the men closely. All the people gathered closely followed the development of this unpleasant situation, waiting for its resolution. The man replied decisively that the battle against Spinola's army was over, so they were moving out right now. All the mercenaries present unanimously supported his correct and fair point of view on this issue. The defenders loudly said that he was absolutely right in his demands for the terms of the contract to be fulfilled. The boy persistently told Captain Ballman that the contract would not be completed until he decided to put an end to it. The experienced man solemnly presented him with an official document with the terms of the previously concluded agreement. He confidently replied that the document stated that he would serve until the end of the battle against Spinola's army. His numerous troops have not yet been completely defeated and pose a serious threat to the fortress. The man replied to Prince Henry that legal papers were much more important in this case than personal ambitions. Prince Henry was extremely furious at such an unexpected and impudent answer from a simple mercenary. He passionately insisted that the Spaniards would definitely attack again, and how could they fight without his help? The main character also listened very attentively to this important conversation at that very tense moment. The man calmly replied that if the prince wanted to sign a new contract, that was a completely different story. He will need 200 experienced men as reliable reinforcements to continue military operations. Each hired soldier receives a salary of 4 gold guilders per month for his service. Together with him and his soldiers, the total salary comes to 1,500 guilders. The mercenary asked directly whether the prince could now pay this amount in hard silver coins. Prince Henry answered honestly that he did not have that kind of money at the moment. There are not enough silver coins stored here in the fortress yet. However, the money is urgently needed by the families of the deceased and the injured who will never get up again due to their injuries. In principle, the man knew very well that it was now completely impossible to obtain the necessary amount of money to pay the mercenaries. The man began to firmly say that if there was no new contract, they as mercenaries would decide for themselves when to leave and risk their lives for a reward. Naturally, all the mercenary soldiers present unanimously supported their experienced and fair captain in this fundamental matter. All the mercenaries looked confidently at their commander at that tense moment of making an important decision about their future fate. The captain politely bid farewell to His Highness Prince Henry, observing the necessary protocol and military etiquette before leaving. The commander firmly replied that his men would leave the fortress immediately since their contractual obligations had been fully fulfilled according to the agreement reached. Prince Henry was naturally very angry at this unexpected decision to leave the fortress at such a critical moment. The protagonist stood thoughtfully to the side and watched attentively the unfolding conflict between the prince and the mercenary captain. The man and his loyal army immediately began to busily gather, preparing for an immediate exit from the fortress. All the mercenary soldiers began to leave the fortress in an orderly manner, following the orders of their respected commander. All the warriors began to methodically collect their personal belongings and equipment in order to leave the fortress as quickly as possible. The mercenaries also carefully collected their wounded comrades who had been injured in the recent battle with the Spanish troops. There were indeed a lot of wounded soldiers after the brutal battle, and many needed serious medical attention. Many brave warriors remained forever on the battlefield, giving their lives to fulfill their military duty. All the surviving mercenaries gathered together and prepared to leave the fortress in an organized manner as a large group. The main character carefully watched this entire process of gathering and preparing for the departure of professional warriors. The people inside the fortress also watched the mercenaries leave with concern, realizing their vulnerability without professional protection. The captain approached Isaac and said directly that he was also a mercenary and the contract had to be fulfilled by now. The commander suggested that the Japanese warrior leave the castle with them, since his obligations were also formally completed. The protagonist confidently said that he was staying because his target was in this place among the Spanish soldiers. After these words, the mercenaries simply began to calmly leave the fortress, leaving its defenders alone with the approaching danger. The protagonist was sincerely grateful to the Netherlands and Prince Henry for the opportunity to fight against the Spanish invaders. The departing man suddenly stopped at the threshold, hearing these unexpected words of the Japanese warrior about gratitude and duty. The captain said he did not understand his motives, but when he heard this statement he understood its special meaning. However, he hopes that Isaac will definitely meet his sworn enemy and will be able to carry out his planned revenge. By the way, let the Japanese warrior say his name so that the captain can remember it forever. The protagonist shook his hand firmly and solemnly said that his name was Lorenzo D. Wolfsburg. Let the captain know that his skill at arms is the finest in the entire Holy Roman Empire today. After these solemn words of farewell, the mercenaries finally left the fortress, leaving its inhabitants in danger. The experienced male captain walked thoughtfully behind all his men, thinking about the meeting with the unusual Japanese warrior. Meanwhile, the captain suddenly stopped on the road, thinking seriously about something after talking with Isaac. The commander became deeply immersed in thoughts about war duty and honor, which the Japanese samurai had touched upon in conversation. The captain slowly looked at the makeshift cemetery with crosses where his comrades who had fallen in battle rested. He stood at attention and solemnly saluted all the fallen soldiers who had fallen in the recent battle. There were indeed a great many brave warriors who died, and each of them deserved respect and grateful memory. The protagonist stood and watched the mercenaries leave when a worried Prince Henry approached him. The prince replied that Isaac would have to fight alone to repay his debt to those who had helped him. Heinrich asked what would happen if the Japanese man died and was unable to avenge the death of his teacher. Isaac replied that there are times when you cannot pay for mercy with money, but the main thing is not to forget about it. He firmly said that the desire to repay a debt of honor is the true military duty to those who helped. For him, revenge means the same thing as fulfilling a sacred duty to the memory of a deceased teacher. The Japanese warrior then began to slowly retreat to prepare for the upcoming battle with superior enemy forces. The next day, all the inhabitants of the fortress continued their intense work to restore the damaged fortifications. All defenders rebuilt the fortress as best they could, understanding the critical importance of fortifications in the face of a new threat. Zeta and her experienced grandfather also actively helped in the restoration work, making their own contribution. The trumpeter on the tower suddenly began to play an alarm signal, attracting the attention of all the people in the fortress. All the inhabitants immediately turned their close attention to the sounds of the trumpet, which foretell important news or danger. Prince Henry was very surprised by the sudden appearance of the signal, as he did not expect any important events. The experienced commander replied that it was an urgent message from their allies who were passing on critical information. The messenger escapes pursuit by a large Spanish army which is trying to prevent the delivery of an important message. Prince Henry immediately began to run quickly up the fortress wall to better assess the situation. The protagonist immediately grabbed his trusty firearm, preparing to help the pursued messenger. All the defenders began to quickly approach the walls to watch the unfolding dramatic scene of the chase. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, the observers stopped at convenient positions to get a better view of the events taking place below. The defenders noticed that the desperately galloping messenger was indeed being pursued by armed Spanish warriors on fast horses. The pursuers naturally wanted to catch the messenger at any cost and prevent the delivery of an important message to the Allies. The exhausted messenger galloped with all his might, trying to break away from the enemy horsemen who were relentlessly pursuing him. The man on the wall began to shout loudly to the messenger to gallop towards them faster and take cover. The protagonist grabbed his battle-tested weapon, tightly preparing for decisive action. Meanwhile, the experienced shooter began to carefully aim at his pursuers, choosing the best target for the shot. Prince Henry said that the Japanese would not be able to hit the target because the distance was too great. However, the main character did not listen to his doubts and stubbornly continued to carefully aim at the moving targets. Those around him also told him that the riders were moving at full speed, making it extremely difficult to aim. The main character began to aim with concentration despite all the doubts and warnings of the people around him. The experienced shooter held his breath to aim properly and make the most accurate shot at a moving target. The Spanish warriors continued to relentlessly pursue the messenger, trying to catch up with him before he reached the fortress. All those watching the chase were very alarmed by this tense situation and the outcome of the pursuit. Isaac was ready to shoot at that critical moment and fired a well-aimed shot at one of his pursuers. All the defenders in the fortress were very surprised by the instant result of an incredibly long and accurate shot. The deadly bullet began to rapidly approach the unsuspecting Spanish horseman at full gallop. Meanwhile, one of the pursuing warriors suddenly simply fell from his horse, struck by a well-aimed shot from a Japanese shooter. Naturally, his comrades were extremely surprised by the sudden death of their comrade from an unknown and invisible enemy. The Spanish horsemen did not understand how this was even possible, since they had not seen the archer at such a great distance. Meanwhile, the horse of the dead rider also fell to the ground, knocked off its feet by the sudden death of its rider. Prince Henry and all the other observers were genuinely surprised by such an outstanding result of long-range shooting. Even the fleeing messenger himself was amazed by the sudden help from unknown defenders in the distant fortress. None of the participants in the chase understood what it was or where the deadly bullet came from. Meanwhile, the pursuers turned their alarmed attention to the distant fortress from where the shot could come. All the Spaniards were amazed by the fact that Isaac could shoot accurately from such an incredibly long distance. The pursuers immediately began to turn around, hastily realizing the mortal danger from an invisible and invulnerable enemy. All the Spanish soldiers began to quickly turn around to leave the dangerous zone of the unknown sniper. Meanwhile, the rescued messenger was left alone on the road, having received an unexpected respite from pursuit. Prince Henry said in amazement that the distance was at least 500 feet to the target. Naturally, this was a completely stunning shooting result which seemed almost impossible at that time. The protagonist calmly took out cartridges for his musket, preparing for a possible continuation of the battle with the enemies. The experienced marksman methodically began reloading his firearm for the next potential shot at the enemy. Isaac began to carefully pour the gunpowder into the barrel, taking all necessary precautions when handling weapons. Meanwhile, the chase continued, since not all of the pursuers decided to retreat after the death of their comrade. The protagonist quickly and skillfully reloaded his reliable weapon, preparing it for the next decisive shot. Meanwhile, the experienced guy again carefully took aim at the remaining pursuers, choosing a new suitable target. The Spanish horseman almost caught up with the exhausted messenger, who was trying with all his might to reach the saving fortress. It was at that critical moment that the protagonist fired again, aiming at the most dangerous of his pursuers. The Japanese fired straight at the man who had almost caught up with the messenger and was preparing to deliver the fatal blow. All observers again turned their amazed attention to the result of the second incredibly accurate shot. Witnesses realized that it had happened again, and the Japanese shooter was demonstrating truly phenomenal shooting accuracy. Isaac quickly and skillfully reloaded his trusty weapon again for a possible third shot. The experienced guy again confidently aimed at the remaining enemies, not giving them a chance to reorganize for an attack. Then the Japanese warrior fired another accurate shot and again hit the target from an incredible distance. Meanwhile, all the remaining pursuers began to stop, abruptly realizing the mortal danger from the invisible sniper. One of the Spanish men said loudly that he did not intend to go near that damned place again. The demoralized enemies actually began to retreat, hastily saving their lives from the accurate Japanese marksmen. All observers noticed that the Spaniards began to avoid further clashes with the invisible enemy. Isaac calmly took aim again at the fleeing enemies, deciding to finally demoralize them with accurate shooting. Following the fleeing Spaniard, the experienced marksman shot him straight in the head, demonstrating ruthless efficiency. All witnesses were still very much surprised by the incredible accuracy and composure of the Japanese warrior. The remaining Spaniards were scared to death by the sudden appearance of such a dangerous and invulnerable enemy. However, they had no choice but to quickly run away from the deadly sniper's kill zone. The rescued messenger at this point had almost reached the safety of the fortress towers and gates. Prince Heinrich said with admiration that it was an excellent and professional job by the Japanese marksman. The protagonist modestly said that he needed to fire the first shot to hit the enemy's horse. The curious man asked why Isaac killed the farthest enemy, whether he wanted to show off his skill. The protagonist explained that when a warrior sees his ally get shot in the back, fear settles in their hearts. The people around did not understand the deep tactical meaning of these words about the psychological impact on the enemy. Prince Henry did not understand what kind of person this mysterious Japanese warrior was with such unusual methods of fighting. The exhausted messenger was greeted by the defenders of the fortress, who were ready to provide him with the necessary assistance and support. Naturally, the man at this moment was very tired after a long chase and could barely breathe. His faithful horse was also extremely exhausted from the long ride at top speed away from his relentless pursuers. Zeta immediately offered the exhausted messenger refreshing water at the very moment when he needed it most. The grateful man greedily grabbed the offered water and began to drink it very quickly, quenching his excruciating thirst. An experienced man approached the messenger to find out the important news for which he risked his life. The commander told the exhausted messenger to immediately report the important information he had delivered. The messenger replied that a huge Spanish army was gathering at Grunwald and seemed to be planning to move there in the coming days. All the defenders present were very surprised and alarmed by this extremely unpleasant news about the approach of the enemy. Prince Henry urgently asked who was the leader of this threatening army and what was known about him. The messenger replied that the army was commanded by the powerful Spanish Prince Alfonso of the Habsburg dynasty. The enemy army consists of 3,000 cavalry, 5,000 light infantry, and 6,000 heavy infantry. All the defenders were very surprised and frightened when they heard these staggering figures about the enemy's strength. Even without taking into account the Bohemian allies, the Spanish army could easily destroy all the defenders of the fortress. The man turned to Henry and said that they had not even restored the walls after the last battle. The protagonist understood the situation and suggested simply leaving the castle since resistance seemed pointless. Prince Henry began to seriously consider all possible courses of action in this critical situation. Inside the fortress, a military council gathered to discuss a strategy for defense or a possible retreat. Naturally, all the commanders began to actively discuss a plan of action against the superior forces of the Spanish army. There are only two paths that the enemy can take: the Heber Valley and the trade route to Mainz. The protagonist said that the valley was closer to their current location and more convenient for movement. A large army definitely needs a wide road for the effective movement of troops, supply trains, and artillery. If Isaac had been the leader of the Spaniards, he would certainly have chosen a well-developed trade route to move along. Prince Henry said grimly that it did not matter where the enemies came from since the defenders had no chance of victory. The protagonist firmly suggested checking the enemy's location and plans with the help of a reconnaissance operation. The man began to shout that this was extremely dangerous since the scouts could be caught just like the messenger. Henry said decisively that it was vital for them to find out accurate information about the enemy's plans and forces. The prince replied that he was leaving the castle to his uncle and was taking Isaac with him on a dangerous reconnaissance mission. The experienced man simply looked at the prince in silence, understanding the seriousness and danger of the upcoming undertaking. Henry ordered that fast horses be prepared, adding that Franz and Jenth would accompany them. The protagonist agreed to go on reconnaissance, as was decided at the fortress's military council. Meanwhile, in the picturesque mountains, events were unfolding that would change the course of the entire military campaign. The surrounding nature there was very beautiful, creating a deceptive impression of peace and tranquility. Prince Henry and his small company moved cautiously forward along the mountain paths towards the enemy positions. Henry said that the view here was certainly impressive, but it would take 2 days for an army of 8,000 to cross the valley. The protagonist replied that the Spaniards would make stops at night to sleep and rest or continue moving. It was at that moment that the reconnaissance group suddenly stopped, noticing something suspicious ahead. The prince said that 200 or 300 men could camp in the narrow passage of the valley. The man replied that it was better not to take risks and not to run into one of the advance units of the Spanish army. The prince said that he knew these places, and from here they would climb the mound to observe the enemies. The scouts began to carefully climb the mountains, just as the experienced Prince Henry had said. After some time of intense climbing, they were already in a convenient observation position from above. Prince Henry looked in amazement at the grand spectacle of the Spanish army below. The protagonist cautiously asked if this was indeed the main Spanish army of Prince Alfonso. The other participants in the reconnaissance were also genuinely surprised by the size of the enemy military camp they saw. The scouts saw many war horses grazing in the meadows near the military camp. Prince Henry said gloomily that the army was much larger than the scout who had arrived earlier had said. Observers saw a large number of weapons and waving flags of various Spanish and Allied units. From what was seen, one could roughly guess how many enemy soldiers were in the camp. There were indeed a lot of Spanish warriors, much more than the defenders of the fortress expected. The enemy army was several times larger than the force that had previously stormed the fortress. All Spanish units moved slowly forward, preparing for a decisive attack on the fortress. Meanwhile, the prince excitedly said that their number reached 15,000 well-armed warriors. The man asked worriedly whether the enemies were still gathering or were they all ready to attack the castle. The prince pointed his finger and told his comrades to look where the troops were concentrated, since they would obviously go through the valley. Meanwhile, the Spanish troops began to actively move in a certain direction, preparing for the march. Isaac asked with interest what kind of person this Prince Alfonso was and what his personal qualities were. Henry replied that Alfonso of the Habsburg dynasty was cowardly and arrogant, but nevertheless remained a prince. It was at that moment that the scouts were observing their future enemy in his military camp. Meanwhile, Prince Alfonso himself was in one of the luxurious tents of the Spanish camp. There was actually that same Prince Alfonso who commanded this entire huge army. The arrogant prince was drinking expensive wine at that very moment, enjoying the luxury of military life. Naturally, he was guarded by countless loyal people who were ready to give their lives for the prince. Meanwhile, servants brought him exquisite food on silver platters, as befits a noble person. The prince's gaze was very arrogant and haughty, like that of a man accustomed to unconditional obedience. Meanwhile, Prince Henry's armor glittered in the sun, revealing the presence of scouts on the summit. This distance was really very far, barely discernible in the mountain haze among the rocky peaks. Even the prince himself noticed this strange detail on the horizon with his keen eye as an experienced military leader. He immediately turned to his faithful companion Rodrigo with a serious expression on his face and a tense voice. The devoted man immediately approached his master and respectfully asked what he would order to be done. The prince replied that there was definitely someone alive or watching on the distant top of the high cliff. After these words, the attentive man directed his gaze to where his master was pointing among the mountain slopes. He honestly admitted that he could not see anything suspicious at such a great distance in the mountains. The prince firmly stated that he would never have told him such things if there really were no people there. Suddenly changing the subject, he said that for dinner, he wanted a beautifully roasted white partridge with the addition of aromatic rosemary. The understanding man immediately waved his hand at his master, since he perfectly understood the whole essence of what was said and ordered. After this conversation, the prince and his faithful team immediately set off back along the familiar mountain path to the camp. Wise Isaac declared that they certainly could not withstand such a numerous and formidable enemy army in open battle. The noble Prince Henry looked at him attentively after these cautious words about military strategy and tactics. He calmly replied that his brother's Protestant army was now in Prague to fight against the powerful Habsburg monarchy. At that very tense moment, someone present accidentally broke a dry branch under his heavy foot. The prince began to draw strategic plans on the wet sand and explained that he himself had been to these places many times before. The main highway leading to Prague from the Spanish allies and the Netherlands intersects at this strategically important point. however a vital corridor reliably connecting all Spanish lands into a single military system passes here. The route through Flanders and Savoy necessarily passes through this critical mountainous terrain and fortified positions. If this strategic castle were captured by enemies, the Protestant Netherlands would be completely isolated from their allies and inevitably destroyed. They were obliged to protect their allies and territories from the impending threat at any cost and with all their might. Wise Isaac declared that in such a case every precious minute counted. It was necessary to quietly return and prepare for the decisive battle. The prince confidently said that the fastest and safest way there was through the dense mountain forest. After these words, they immediately set off along a winding forest path among tall trees and thickets. An experienced man told Prince Henry that the horses would not be able to pass through such terrain. They would not have time to reach the castle. The prince calmly replied that he should not worry unnecessarily since they had to reach the main road through the forest. It was at that critical moment that he turned his attention to something very strange and suspicious ahead. Right in front of them, unexpectedly, there was a fairly large and deep lake with clear water among the trees. He responded with relief that it was indeed a real lake with clean drinking water for people. At that very moment, the attentive man turned to the prince with important information about the detail he had noticed. He noticed that thick smoke from some kind of fire was clearly visible from a source near the lake. One of the companions suggested that it was definitely the hut of a hunter or a local forester in these parts. Prince Henry said firmly that they had only one road ahead and said that one of them would go with him. The loyal man agreed without hesitation to go with him to explore the dangerous place and obtain important information. The second companion said that in the meantime, he would give the horses exhausted by the long journey some clean lake water to drink. Prince Henry and the faithful man began to carefully climb up the slope towards the source of the mysterious smoke. Isaac, in that tense moment, began to look around, carefully studying the area for possible threats. The remaining man, as he had promised earlier, began to water the tired horses with cool water from the mountain lake. The horses, exhausted by the long journey, greedily drank clean, cool water straight from the crystal lake among the mountains. The tired man himself also quenched his thirst, drinking refreshing water at the same moment next to the animals. Isaac stood guard just before the dark forest, carefully observing his surroundings and possible movements. The wary guy peered carefully into the thicket of the forest, trying to spot something suspicious among the trees. Suddenly Isaac turned his close attention to something very strange and disturbing in the depths of the forest. After this discovery, he immediately lit the fuse of his firearm in preparation for a possible clash with the enemy. The burning fuse of his musket was almost at the very end, ready to fire at any moment. Just at this critical moment, Isaac suddenly noticed an enemy horse with an armed man in front of him. Isaac immediately aimed the muzzle of his loaded cannon at the approaching unknown enemy among the trees. The guy who suddenly appeared was very surprised and shocked when he suddenly saw an armed enemy in front of him. The enemy knight at that very moment quickly pointed his sharp-bladed weapon at him. It was at this critical moment that he desperately tried to reach his opponent with a cold weapon for close combat. The main character made an accurate shot just at that very decisive moment of the confrontation with the enemy knight. The sharpshooter hit his dangerous opponent perfectly in the heart, killing him with one shot. But at that very moment, Isaac himself also fell to the ground from the blow he received from his opponent. His trusty firearm suddenly jumped out of his weakened hands and rolled across the ground. The wounded Isaac rolled painfully across the hard ground at that critical moment, losing strength from the wounds he had received. Then his precious weapon fell with a crash straight into the deep lake and disappeared under the water. The defeated enemy knight naturally also lay on the ground after such a fatal wound to the chest. The man who was watering the horses was very surprised and frightened by the sudden sounds of fighting near the lake. He immediately dropped everything he was doing and started running to help the main character. At that moment he stopped and shouted loudly that more enemy forces were advancing through the forest. Isaac was very surprised and worried by this extremely alarming information about the approaching enemies. At this dangerous moment he was barely able to get close to his faithful man to get help. The enemy knight looked straight into his eyes in that tense moment, preparing for the final blow. At this critical moment, at least 3 armed opponents were visible approaching them through the forest. At this decisive moment, the brave man fired his accurate crossbow in the direction of the nearest enemy. He hit the enemy knight right on target, but the arrow couldn't penetrate his strong metal armor. But naturally, the arrow could do nothing serious against his strong armor, and the knight successfully attacked the man. The wounded Isaac watched the whole dangerous battle closely at that critical moment without having the strength to help. The brave boy noticed that the enemy knights began to methodically surround them from all sides for a decisive attack. The experienced man already had a clear plan of action in his head to save the situation. Just at this critical moment, one of the enemy knights reached the main character's side. Isaac grabbed the hilt of his trusty sword with all his might, preparing for desperate resistance to the enemy. Just at this tense moment, the enemy horse began to resist strongly and kick under its rider. Isaac carefully examined his approaching opponent, assessing his weak points for a precise sword strike. Immediately after this, he began to literally cut the horse with his sharp sword in order to knock the rider to the ground. Naturally, the enemy man immediately began to fall uncontrollably from his wounded horse straight onto the hard ground. After a few long seconds, he finally fell to the ground next to the lake, losing his balance and his weapon. Isaac walked with difficulty towards his fallen enemy, preparing to deliver the final fatal blow with his sword. After this, he decisively removed the heavy metal helmet from the head of his fallen opponent for identification. Isaac raised his trusty weapon up, preparing to deliver the final blow to his defenseless opponent. After that, he instantly and mercilessly killed him with one precise blow of his sword to a vital place. All the other enemy knights were very surprised and shocked by the sudden death of their comrade. Then Isaac took out his bloody weapon and looked at them menacingly at this decisive moment. He then turned his alarmed attention to his wounded comrade lying near the lake. All participants in the battle suddenly stopped at this tense moment, assessing the changed situation on the battlefield. One of the remaining enemy knights looked intently straight at the protagonist, preparing for another attack. Isaac jumped to his feet and began to look at him, menacingly clutching the hilt of his sword. Isaac quickly pulled the long spear straight out of the soft ground next to the lake, preparing for another battle. The enemy knights became active at this dangerous moment and began to decisively move towards him to encircle him. Isaac was already knee-deep in the cool water of the lake, retreating from the enemies pressing in from all sides. One of the bravest enemy knights on horseback was rapidly approaching him through the shallow waters of the lake. Isaac swung his long spear in a sweeping motion to reach his approaching opponent on a fast horse. Just at this critical moment, he thrust the sharp spear with all his might straight into the horse's leg. Naturally, the wounded man immediately fell uncontrollably from his horse into the cold water of the lake with a loud splash. After this fall, he fell heavily into the lake, creating large waves and splashes around him. His comrades in arms were very surprised and worried by the sudden fall of their comrade into the water. The man who fell into the water began to scream loudly from the unbearable pain in his leg pierced by a spear. It was at this crucial moment that Isaac grabbed him in a chokehold to finally destroy his opponent. At this critical moment, they began to fight desperately right in the cold water of the lake amidst the spray. After some time, both opponents completely submerged underwater, continuing their deadly fight in the depths. All the other participants in the battle watched them closely at this tense moment from the shore of the lake. Isaac fought underwater just as hard and fiercely as he did on dry land. At the same time, Prince Henry was walking carefully with a man along a forest path towards the source of the smoke. He asked if it was a gunshot. The man replied that it was definitely the sound of a firearm. At this alarming moment, they turned sharply towards the sounds of the battle and ran to help. After that, they quickly rushed towards the sounds of gunshots and screams coming from the lake through the forest. Prince Henry noticed at this moment many dead bodies scattered along the shore of the lake among the blood. The forester immediately began to examine them carefully, trying to determine the cause of death and the identities of the deceased. He noticed that one enemy knight had been shot straight in the heart with a firearm. The prince looked at him, carefully studying the nature of the wound and trying to understand the circumstances of the battle. He then noticed a second dead man lying next to the first among the thickets near the lake. The man bitterly informed Prince Henry that their faithful comrade was unfortunately dead. The prince himself looked at him with sadness at this tragic moment, realizing the loss of a comrade in arms. The prince was extremely interested and important to know where Isaac was now after this whole battle. At this critical moment, the man noticed something in the water and began to quickly draw the string of his bow. After this discovery, he began to shout loudly, drawing the prince's attention to what was happening in the lake. Isaac still continued to desperately fight underwater with his opponent for life and death. The enemy knight was looking straight at him at that moment, trying to deliver a fatal blow underwater. The prince watched this underwater battle closely, unable to intervene and help Isaac. At that moment they saw a terrible picture. There were 3 dead bodies in the lake floating on the surface. The prince could not understand whether this was the work of Isaac or the result of the general battle. At this anxious moment, the man began to calm the horses frightened by the sounds of the battle on the shore of the lake. At that moment, the alarmed man turned to the prince with important information about the movement in the water. Then he pointed to the lake, and the prince saw air bubbles coming out of the depths. He watched this disturbing process carefully, trying to understand what was happening underwater to Isaac. Prince Henry immediately drew his sharp weapon, preparing for any developments in the lake. At this critical moment, a hand with the main character's weapon appeared from the water holding a sword. It was the main character himself who was finally able to get out of the deep lake alive. Prince Henry immediately went into the water after him to help him get to the safe shore. The exhausted guy began to say something unintelligible, gasping for breath after being underwater for a long time with the enemy. The main character was pulled with great difficulty from the cold lake to the solid shore among his comrades. After all these events, it was already dark night, and they set up a temporary camp for rest. The wounded Isaac lay and rested after a difficult battle, restoring his strength for the further journey to the castle. His pale face was worried and tense at that moment from the pain of the wounds he had received. Zeta ran to him and anxiously told him not to die under any circumstances. Prince Henry then also entered the tent to check on the protagonist's condition after the battle. He was with some experienced man at that moment who understood how to treat wounds. The doctor said that he would disinfect and carefully bandage the main character's dangerous wound to prevent infection. He immediately set about doing this with professional precision and caution so as not to cause additional pain. Prince Henry asked about the left hand. It was open. Would it be possible to do something with it? The doctor replied that there was a barber with surgical skills in their unit, but he could not do anything. Isaac began to weakly address the girl standing next to him, asking for help. The caring girl immediately turned to him, attentively ready to fulfill any of his requests for recovery. Isaac asked to be given a sharp fish hook and strong linen thread so that he could treat the wound himself. He also asked to bring his grandfather's blacksmith's device for heating metal to the required temperature. The smart girl immediately understood what was being discussed and quickly began to bring him everything he needed. At that moment, they began to heat the hook he had asked for until it was red hot over an open fire. The grandfather and the girl were engaged in this important task, carefully holding the metal over the flames of the fire. She then handed him a strong thread ready for use in a self-surgical operation on his arm. Isaac asked her to give him all of this in his hands so he could carry out the painful procedure. At that moment, he looked closely at his deep bleeding wound on his left hand. He literally began to stitch it up right on himself with a hot hook, not paying attention to the pain. All present watched this incredibly painful picture of self-medication with horror and admiration. The caring girl was very surprised and frightened by the main character's determination to treat himself. The protagonist told her to take the end of the thread and pull it carefully at his command. The girl began to tie up her long hair and confidently said that she would definitely cope with it. She began to help him with this painful procedure, following all his clear instructions. The girl began to carefully pull the thread as he asked, trying not to cause additional pain. Naturally, the main character was in unbearable pain at that moment, but he endured it to save his hand. But his deep wound began to gradually heal thanks to skillful stitching with a hot hook. The frightened girl continued to look at him closely, worrying about his condition and well-being. They continued this whole painful process, everyone present helping him cope with the pain. Isaac continued to courageously treat himself without asking for help from professional doctors or surgeons. Everyone continued to look at him in horror, admiring his incredible willpower and determination. After some time, Isaac finally finished the painful procedure of suturing the wound. Zeta began to gently wipe the cold sweat from her worried face with a soft cloth. The main character dropped a medical device, thanks to which he was able to successfully stitch up a dangerous wound on his arm. The protagonist breathed a heavy sigh of relief after completing this painful but necessary self-treatment procedure. He was then carefully placed back on the soft bed for further rest and recuperation. He literally stitched up his own arm all by himself without the help of any professional doctors or surgeons. The experienced doctor began began to carefully bandage his arm with clean bandages to prevent infection of the wound. The caring girl began to wet a clean cloth in cool water to cool his forehead. After that, she carefully placed a damp cloth on his hot forehead to relieve the fever. Naturally, the kind girl was very worried about the guy's condition and his further recovery. The exhausted Isaac had already passed out from the pain and was simply lying unconscious at this critical moment. At the same time, other important events were taking place in the distant mountains. There were numerous enemy knights there preparing for a decisive attack on the castle. One of the experienced men turned his close attention to something very important in the valley. There were really a lot of them, a whole army ready for a large-scale battle against the defenders of the castle. They all walked in an organized manner along the narrow cliff of the mountain, observing strict military order and discipline. Also, there was their chief prince directing the entire military operation against the Protestant castle. Naturally, at this dangerous moment, stones fell down from the cliffs under the weight of the passing troops. There was that very enemy prince who was planning to capture the strategically important castle. He was looking thoughtfully out the window of his carriage at that moment, thinking about the upcoming battle. The man accompanying him simply remained silent and sat calmly next to him, not disturbing the prince's thoughts. At that moment, the prince approached him with an important question about military strategy. He replied that he also considered it the right decision to take the safer but more boring route. The man answered him that it was absolutely impossible, and the prince looked at the surrounding landscape. The red colorful maple creates a truly beautiful autumn landscape around their route along the mountain roads. These places are very different from the usual landscapes of Castile with their northern harsh beauty. After battles and victories, I would like to know what he thinks about the upcoming battle. The man began to say that of course he was ready since he was personally taking part in military operations. The prince looked at him at that moment with a slight smile, appreciating the devotion of his companion. He said that Spinola, who was reputed to be an invincible military leader, was defeated by one marksman in battle. Naturally, he knew perfectly well who he was and what fame this famous commander enjoyed. According to the scout, he shot the soldier at full speed at an incredible distance of 150 meters. With so many warriors and a destroyed castle, he is sure that they will try to kill him at any cost. The accompanying man simply remained silent at that moment, pondering the prince's words about the impending dangers. What will happen if he fails, even though he is an experienced commander? The man began to say that the prince should not say such terrible and pessimistic things before the battle. He replied that the honor of their Spanish nobles and knights would be mercilessly trampled in the event of defeat. They will not be able to return home without a glorious victory over the Protestant heretics in the castle. This is how they are fundamentally different from ordinary mercenaries who fight only for money. They fight with their dignity at stake, and if that is not the case, success will certainly be theirs. The man looked at him confidently, fully sharing these noble principles of warfare. The prince said that if everything really went as they planned, then victory would be theirs. His heavy carriage continued to move slowly forward along the winding mountain road towards its destination. Numerous troops followed him in organized columns along narrow mountain paths. They were moving in an organized manner through the dangerous mountains at that moment, preparing for the decisive assault on the castle. At the same time, important military preparations were taking place in the besieged fortress. There all those capable of holding arms gathered within the fortress walls for a final council. The prince and his experienced uncle gathered all the people to announce the important news about the war. He said that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow the Spanish army would attack them and they would fight to the last. Naturally, everyone present was greatly shocked by such alarming news about the impending threat. One of the men asked if he was really ready to sacrifice himself and everyone for the sake of his older brother. He is also a prince of the Wittelsbach family and has the right to a safer life at court. The prince said that the man should know that his mother was a simple servant and he would never become king. The man said that even in such circumstances he remains a prince by blood and deserves a better fate. He is ordered to fight in the ranks of the soldiers and fight side by side with them until the last drop of blood. As long as he fights, his mother can live peacefully at court, and he does not mind such a fate. The man remained silent but looked at him carefully, understanding the seriousness of the situation and ready for the upcoming battle. Another man in the crowd said that Prince Henry was a fine warrior by birth with natural talent. This time the upcoming battle will be decisive for the fate of the entire castle and the lives of its defenders. What if this fight will be their final end and they will all die in an unequal fight? Why not then accept the enemy's offer to surrender and save the lives of all the people in the fortress? At that tense moment, everyone present looked back towards the entrance to the War Council Hall. The main character suddenly appeared before them despite his severe injuries from the recent battle at the lake. The prince immediately noticed his appearance and was surprised that he was able to get out of bed. The protagonist said that the enemy had entered the Heber Valley and would spend the whole night there, so a sudden attack. If they left the castle now, they wouldn't be able to reach safety before dawn. The main weakness of Spanish heavy armor is that it becomes heavy in water and mud. Taking up a position by the river would give them no tactical advantage against the well-armed Spanish knights. Prince Henry said that only in this way would they not be overcome by the huge army that was concentrating. The boy continued to say that there was an open place where the Spanish prince and his retinue were supposed to rest. Everyone present was completely stunned by such unexpected and important military information from the main character. One of the men asked if the protagonist would try to shoot the Spanish Prince Alfonso from an ambush. With his serious injuries, he won't be able to hold a gun in his hands. They will attack from the south side of the castle. The main character said that everything would definitely work out. He had a goal that needed to be achieved even if. The prince said that they had no extra men to send with him. Every warrior was important. The main character asked to be escorted to the cliff from where the location of the Spanish prince's camp was clearly visible. The man simply remained silent, considering the danger of such a risky mission for the wounded protagonist. He was told directly that he was physically unable to shoot a heavy gun with one good hand. Zeta appeared in the hall at that moment and decisively said that she would go with him to help. She held his heavy firearm confidently at this point, demonstrating her readiness to fight. Grandfather immediately began to worry a lot and ask what she had come up with, because this was a real war. She replied that if they did not do anything now, they would all surely die from the Spaniards. She also doesn't want to die in this castle yet and is ready to fight for her life. And he will fight bravely and will definitely see the legendary utopia that he has dreamed about all his life. Everyone present in the hall listened attentively to her bold and decisive words about the upcoming battle. The main character said that she was absolutely right. This was indeed her war for freedom and the future. Let her fight bravely for her life and be sure to get to the desired utopia after victory. At that moment, a man from the crowd said that the little girl was saying the right things about the war. They can't just sit and passively wait for them all to be mercilessly slaughtered by Spanish soldiers. The girl said that she had thoroughly cleaned the musket and had it fully assembled for firing. The protagonist carefully took his repaired weapon into his still weak hands after being wounded. She also said that her caring grandfather repaired his armor, which was damaged in the battle. The guy looked gratefully at his faithful assistant during this touching moment of recovery before the fight. The protagonist sincerely thanked her and his grandfather for all the work they had done to repair the equipment. The girl shared that she could light the fuse and load the gun and he would shoot accurately. The protagonist looked closely at Prince Henry, waiting for the final decision on the military operation. At that moment, he told them to find something more serious for this brave girl. Then he looked at the boy and smiled, slightly approving of the courage of the young assistant. One man began to shout loudly that they were real Palatinate soldiers and should not give in. Are they really happy that the little girl will win the war, or are they really okay with that? Are they seriously joking? This can't happen in real life. It's simply impossible. This is their own war and they must defend their castle from the Spanish invaders themselves. It is a real shame for them if they give up the initiative to an ordinary child in military operations. The girl looked at the main character and smiled, and her grandfather cried bitterly at that moment. Prince Henry said firmly that they were going ahead on a dangerous military mission. At this critical moment, a dark night fell, ideal for launching a surprise attack on the enemy. All the defenders of the castle gathered around a bright fire for a last council of war before the battle. They were morally prepared for the upcoming decisive battle against the superior forces of the Spanish army. Many of the tired warriors were already asleep, gathering strength before the dawn attack on the enemy. They all patiently waited for their moment of glory and the opportunity to prove themselves in battle. Prince Henry said that their opponents numbered about 1,000 well-armed and trained soldiers. The experienced man watched closely as preparations were made for the upcoming night attack. He asked if the protagonist had taken up his designated firing position on the hill. The man replied that these mountains were like a vegetable garden for the hunter who had gone with him. They would surely arrive. Then they looked at each other, carefully realizing the seriousness of the upcoming military undertaking. Prince Henry raised his hand at this solemn moment to give the signal to advance. All the warriors present watched him closely, waiting for the command to begin the attack on the enemy. He replied that their main task was to attack the enemy completely unnoticed. They all listened attentively to his final instructions before the start of the dangerous military operation against the Spaniards. He told them not to tire their horses, prematurely saving their strength for the decisive blow. They approach the enemy as close as possible, and the cavalry will immediately break through their defensive lines. The infantry should follow immediately after the cavalry, supporting the offensive and completing the destruction of the Spanish camp. Let them destroy these bastards before they come to their senses and organize resistance. Prince Henry solemnly ordered everyone to go into the decisive battle against the Spanish army. All the warriors immediately went forward, ready to fulfill their duty to the castle and their comrades. The infantry began to move forward in an organized manner towards the enemy camp in the valley. They all went to war knowing that it might be their last battle in life. At this moment, the unsuspecting Spaniards were sleeping peacefully in their tents by the river. The enemy warriors began to cautiously approach them through the forest, maintaining complete silence. They all looked carefully at the sleeping camp, choosing the best positions for a surprise attack. The Spanish guard stood at his post at that moment, oblivious to the approaching danger. Then he noticed strange movements in the forest and suddenly saw enemy warriors. He began to shout loudly about the alarm, trying to wake up his sleeping comrades in the camp. All the Spaniards immediately jumped up from the ground and were extremely surprised by the sudden night attack. The trumpeter began to urgently sound the alarm with loud sounds of his trumpet throughout the military camp. Prince Henry ordered his warriors to launch a decisive attack on the surprised Spaniards. The trumpeter continued to report that it was a real alarm, not a drill or a false alarm. Everyone started to get up immediately because this was a real enemy attack. They were being attacked by Protestants. They were people who did not understand where such an unexpected and determined enemy came from. Everyone who could speak shouted loudly that this was a real enemy attack on the camp. Everyone was sounding the alarm with all their might, trying to wake up and organize their sleepy comrades. Prince Henry said that they were breaking through the defense. Let everyone follow him into the attack. The man also went into battle and said that no one should lag behind him. Everyone went forward, realizing that the success of the entire operation depended on the speed of their actions. This was a real attack. This was a real alarm that required immediate action from everyone. The trumpeter continued to conscientiously carry out his important mission of warning his comrades of danger. The Spanish warriors immediately began to gather urgently, trying to organize resistance to the sudden attack. But at this critical moment it was already too late, and the enemies were very close. Prince Henry began to fight bravely, first setting an example for his warriors in this battle. The Spaniards really did not have time to do anything to organize an effective defense of their camp. The attacking troops moved forward rapidly at this decisive moment of the surprise night attack on the enemy. Prince Henry and his brave army began to furiously attack the surprised Spanish soldiers. Many Spanish warriors began to fall under the blows of the Protestant soldiers who suddenly attacked them. They all fell into the cold river water at that moment under the onslaught of the resolutely attacking enemies. The man began to say that they had successfully gotten rid of the knights before they had time to saddle their horses. The heavily armored Spanish warriors are quite weak on their own without their trusty war horses. They began to attack them methodically, using the advantage of surprise and superior maneuverability. Of course, the Spaniards were completely confused and did not know what to do in such a situation. The prince was in his luxurious tent at this critical moment of the enemy's attack. Alarmed soldiers rushed to his tent with important news about the battle that had begun. The man started shouting loudly that it was a real enemy attack on their military camp. The prince asked again whether he meant a real serious enemy attack or a false alarm. He ordered everyone to gather urgently to organize resistance to the enemy who had suddenly attacked them. At that moment they began to urgently help him dress in combat clothing and armor for battle. He replied that the old castle was still a castle worthy of respect for its bravery. It is truly commendable bravery on the part of the enemy to attack first in the dark. At that moment, the girl was carefully watching this entire large-scale battle from above. She saw all the participants fighting fiercely with each other down in the valley. The main character was just lying quietly at that moment, preparing to carry out his mission. The girl told him that a large-scale battle had already begun below between the two armies. She didn't understand and asked if he was okay after his recent injuries. She said he had a fever again and asked how he was feeling. The protagonist said that everything was fine, they should wait a little, let her light the fuse. The girl said that she understood everything and began to fulfill his important request. She began to carefully light a fire to prepare the weapon to fire at the enemy prince. She then carefully lit the fuse as the boy had asked in preparation for the shot. The battle naturally continued at this moment below with increasing intensity and ferocity. The Spaniards were clearly losing at this point due to the suddenness of the attack and their lack of preparation for battle. No one gave them any respite or opportunity to organize an effective defense against the Protestants. The battle was extremely fierce, both sides fought for life and death. The man spoke to attack the enemy as soon as there was the slightest opportunity for a successful strike. The Spaniards finally began to put up some organized resistance to the sudden attack of the Protestants. At that moment, arrows began to fly towards the advancing enemies from the defenders' bows. Naturally, many arrows hit their opponents, causing them serious injuries and death. The wounded warriors fell from the steep cliff at that moment, unable to hold on. Many wounded and killed fell into the cold river, turning its water red. The frightened horses also fell into the river, creating even more chaos in the battle. The bloody battle continued with the same intensity, giving no respite to either side. Prince Henry, of course, was with them at this critical moment, leading the attack. He shouted loudly to his warriors that they were winning over the enemy in this battle. If they move forward just a little bit more, they will fall into the shooting range of the accurate Isaac. He was high on the cliff at that moment, ready to fire the decisive shot. Prince Henry gave the agreed signal to his uncle to coordinate further military actions. After this signal, he began to run forward, rapidly dragging his warriors along with him. His loyal warriors followed right behind him, following the example of their brave commander. They began to actively push the enemy out of their positions, using their advantage in maneuverability. The fierce battle continued, and the outcome of the battle was still uncertain for both sides. The attackers were getting closer and closer to the main objective of their night attack on the Spanish camp. At this crucial moment, they finally saw the enemy tents in the center of the military camp. The man said something about their forces expanding, but the enemies outnumbered them. Prince Henry shouted that this was impossible, they were advancing, let them force the Spanish prince into battle. He then pointed decisively at the richly decorated tent of the enemy commander. At that moment, the man was very surprised by the unexpected developments in the battle. Suddenly, they saw the Spanish prince's magnificent horse standing next to his tent. Prince Henry began to shout loudly that this was indeed the horse of the enemy prince and commander. He then ordered his troops to disperse to the sides, making room for the duel. They were all very much surprised by the sudden appearance of the Spanish prince himself on the battlefield. At that moment, someone loudly announced the appearance of a duke named Jorge Fernandez de Almendra. Everyone immediately began to respectfully make way for him, recognizing his high title and position. Someone said that finally the main enemy appeared on the battlefield for a fair fight. A noble man appeared before them, wearing rich armor and carrying expensive weapons. Prince Henry stood bravely before him, showing neither fear nor doubt. He raised his weapon forward and introduced himself, solemnly stating his name and title. The man said that in order to be able to push back his people with such a small number he met. At that moment, a Spanish knight was closely watching the developments on the battlefield. He raised his sharp weapon at that moment, preparing for possible participation in the battle. Everyone immediately understood the seriousness of the situation and were very surprised by what was happening. The man said that he was the very same duke in shining armor. The man said decisively that he was attacking the enemy to defend the honor of his king. At this point, he began to slowly approach the prince to begin a fair fight. The prince also raised his trusty weapon, preparing for a mortal fight. All those present were in tense anticipation of the beginning of the decisive battle between the commanders. At this point, they began to cautiously approach each other to begin the duel. They then attacked each other simultaneously, starting a fierce sword fight. Everyone present was very surprised by the skill and strength of both fighters. They began to fight fiercely, demonstrating the highest skill skill in handling cold weapons. Their strengths were almost equal at this tense moment, which made the outcome unpredictable. The Spanish man at this critical moment approached the prince for the decisive blow. The prince began to feel fear at the superior skill of his experienced opponent. At that fateful moment the prince swung, but his sword unexpectedly broke from the blow. Naturally, he was very surprised by such an unexpected turn of events in the fight. His loyal troops immediately wanted to run to his aid but did not dare to violate. At this critical moment, the Spanish man was already swinging his weapon to deliver the fatal blow. He swung to finally kill the Protestant prince with one precise blow of his sword. His uncle began to worry greatly about him, seeing the hopelessness of the situation for his nephew. At this decisive moment, someone shot accurately at the Spanish knight's horse from a long distance. The wounded horse began to run forward uncontrollably after being hit so unexpectedly. The prince was very surprised when he saw this unexpected rescue from certain death. The Spanish man looked at him in surprise at that moment, not understanding the source of the shot. At that moment, one of the knights threw a spare sword to the prince to continue the duel. The guy immediately grabbed it deftly and prepared to continue the deadly battle. After this saving moment, he was able to successfully defend himself from the attacks of his dangerous opponent. The Spanish trumpeter raised his trumpet at this moment to give an important signal. Everyone immediately turned their attention to this, expecting important news. Everyone was very surprised and turned their attention to the source of the trumpet signal. The man solemnly announced that His Highness had arrived to take part in the decisive battle. The Spanish prince himself walked slowly towards them, surrounded by his best knights. Prince Henry was very surprised by the appearance of the main enemy on the battlefield. Naturally, everyone immediately realized that this was indeed a Spanish prince and commander of the army. The man said that victory was now guaranteed for the Spanish side. The Protestant opponents were seriously frightened by the appearance of the main enemy commander with reinforcements. The Spanish prince slowly approached them, surrounded by his best and most experienced warriors. The man understood that if they did not defeat him now, the soldiers would gather and defeat them. At that critical moment, he was looking at the mountain where the main character was with a weapon. The girl said that the boy should see what a beautiful horse the Spanish prince has. I wonder who sent her here to take part in this decisive battle for the castle. The girl confidently said that he was the culprit of all the events that were happening, pointing at her companion. Following these words, she carefully handed him his own weapon, which she had been holding until that moment. The young woman began to carefully hold the heavy weapon so that the protagonist could aim correctly and accurately. The protagonist began to aim with concentration, preparing for the decisive shot that could change the outcome of the entire battle. The guy completely focused all his attention on the goal, casting aside all extraneous thoughts and doubts forever. A moment later, he carefully took aim directly at the Spanish prince, who was in the center of the enemy camp. However, his sight began to move treacherously, preventing him from making an accurate and decisive shot at the enemy. The man hurriedly told the girl not to move under any circumstances and to freeze in place. The girl instinctively held her breath at the tense moment, understanding the full importance of the upcoming shot and its consequences. The protagonist then fired decisively, hoping to hit the target and end this dangerous confrontation once and for all. Everyone present immediately paid close attention to this loud shot, the echo of which spread throughout the area. The protagonist, of course, was aiming at the Spanish prince, seeking to neutralize the main threat to his allies and homeland. But to his great regret, it hit the prince's ear straight without causing a mortal wound to the enemy. The Spanish prince immediately fell to the ground after such an unexpected injury, clutching his injured ear with his hands. Everyone around was very surprised and shocked when they saw this unexpected development of events on the battlefield. The prince's confidants began to desperately worry about the health and life of His Highness, not understanding the seriousness of the injury he had received. The soldiers continued to look at their wounded commander in surprise and confusion, not knowing how to proceed. The Spanish prince lay helplessly on the cold ground, clutching his bleeding ear and groaning in pain. One of the men began to scream, desperately calling on everyone to immediately protect and defend His Highness from further attacks. All the soldiers immediately began to move, actively forming a protective ring around their wounded leader and commander. The man began to say irritably that the main character had shamefully missed after all they had warned him not to go in with such wounds. Prince Henry noted carefully that the shooter had indeed hit the target, demonstrating his skill and accuracy. The sniper simply deliberately did not kill the prince, but at the same time demonstrated his impeccable accuracy and professional skills. The girl was very surprised and shocked by such an unexpected turn of events and the skill of her companion. The protagonist began to patiently explain to the stunned girl that this whole shot was just a clever bait. He told her to watch carefully as the prince's adjutants were in no hurry to help their wounded commander. He also asked her to reload her weapon as quickly as possible to be ready for the next shots at the enemies. Zeta apparently understood everything immediately and began to carefully ask if he had really intentionally missed the prince. The skilled girl immediately began to quickly and deftly reload the complex firearm for the next shots. After some time, she completely finished the reloading procedure and prepared the weapon for new use. Isaac then began to aim carefully again, leaning on the girl's shoulder for greater stability and accuracy. After a few tense seconds, a loud, powerful explosion was heard in the air, frightening everyone nearby. This time, the experienced shooter accurately hit one of the enemy knights, seriously wounding the enemy. None of those present could understand where exactly such precise and deadly shooting at the camp was coming from. At that moment, one of the observant men pointed his finger to the side and loudly said that they were shooting from there. Everyone was extremely surprised by the fact that the shooting was carried out from such a great distance and at the same time accurately. The next moment, another loud, deafening explosion sounded, causing everyone to instinctively duck to the ground in fear. Isaac once again hit his intended target without fail, demonstrating his outstanding skill with firearms. The bullet hit the man, who was thrown back by the force of the blow straight towards the silk tent of the Spanish prince. The prince could see in horror the dead body in front of him. His entire luxurious tent was stained with blood. The Spanish aristocrat was both furious and extremely frightened by the bloody events and chaos happening around him. After some time, Isaac again fired a perfectly accurate shot, hitting another target without a single miss. The wounded man began to slowly fall to the ground, bleeding from a fatal gunshot wound to the chest. After that, his lifeless body flew with force straight into the luxurious tent of the frightened Spanish prince. The Spanish prince was very frightened by the bloody carnage and random shooting around him in the camp. The frightened Spanish prince began desperately calling for help from his faithful bodyguard and assistant named Rodrigo. At that very moment, someone began to decisively cut a hole in the thick fabric of his silk tent with a sharp knife. Through the hole that had been made, his devoted bodyguard and faithful companion Rodrigo entered the tent, ready to protect the prince. The experienced warrior told his master to immediately go with him to a safe place away from danger. The prince immediately instinctively closed his eyes in fear, and the man carefully covered him with his body from the bullets. Just at this critical moment, another person was killed right before their eyes, adding to the panic and chaos. The Spanish prince began to climb hastily into his covered carriage, trying to leave the dangerous place as quickly as possible. The aristocrat began to panic and hysterically shout to his coachman that they needed to escape from here immediately at any cost. The frightened prince shouted loudly that they had to get out of here immediately before they were all killed by snipers. His luxurious carriage began to move quickly, taking the frightened prince away from the scene of bloody carnage and death. All those present were very surprised and shocked when they saw such a shameful escape of their commander. The soldiers looked at this shameful spectacle of their leader's flight with undisguised horror and bewilderment. The heavy carriage rushed straight towards them, crushing everything in its path in the prince's desire to save his own life. The Spanish prince did not care at all that his own loyal troops might perish under the wheels of the carriage. The cowardly aristocrat simply began to shamefully flee from the battlefield, abandoning his people to the mercy of fate and his enemies. Zeta asked curiously if they would aim at the rapidly retreating carriage with the fugitive prince. Isaac wisely replied that if they shot the prince, they would definitely not see victory in this war. The noble dignity and honor of the Spanish army will fall into final collapse, which will only strengthen the resistance of our enemies. Then the warriors will be forced to fight zealously and desperately to the last man, avenging their killed commander. But if the Spanish prince shamefully flees from the battlefield, leaving his people without leadership and support, then all his soldiers will lose hope for victory and fighting spirit, which will lead to their quick defeat. The smart girl said that she now understood why he acted in this way and not otherwise. However, his calculation turned out to be correct, and the Spanish prince really did flee shamefully, leaving his army in trouble. The cowardly Spanish prince fled in fear and panic without thinking about the honor and dignity of his high position. All the remaining soldiers were naturally confused and demoralized by the shameful flight of their commander from the battlefield. Many people on both sides died in this bloody battle, leaving behind grief and tears. Zeta began to speak admiringly that Isaac had managed to defeat the Spanish army twice with his amazing weapon. Isaac modestly said that this was not entirely true. All this became possible thanks to her, and thanked the girl. The girl asked excitedly if she could thank him even a little for everything he had done for them. The next day arrived, bringing with it time to sum up the results of the past battle and treat the wounded soldiers. The wounded soldiers were carefully treated and bandaged at this time, providing them with all the necessary medical care and support. Isaac lay motionless right on the street under the open sky, resting after a hard battle and intense shooting. His sophisticated firearms were neatly laid out beside him on a clean cloth for inspection and cleaning. Zeta was carefully cleaning all the parts of the weapon at this moment, removing gunpowder residue and traces of use after the battle. Then the skilled girl carefully assembled all the parts of the weapon together, checking the correct assembly of each mechanism and part. Zeta looked at the fully assembled weapon for a long time, studying its design and features with great interest. After that, she paid close attention to something unusual that she had not noticed before on the surface of the weapon. The curious girl noticed some strange symbol on the weapon and asked with interest what this sign was. Isaac calmly replied that it was a special symbol that had deep meaning and importance to him personally. The girl admitted that she couldn't read the symbol. The guy replied that of course he couldn't, it was written in Japanese. The guy patiently explained that this character is read as Jin and means to give oneself completely for the sake of other people. The girl asked understandingly if this meant sacrificing oneself for the sake of other people and their well-being without regret. Zeta pointed her finger at the mysterious symbol, trying to better understand its meaning and importance to Isaac. Isaac thoughtfully replied that when they first met she mentioned utopia, a place where everyone could live in peace. The girl nodded in agreement and said that it was true, she had indeed mentioned this perfect place in conversation. The protagonist seriously asked her if she really believed that such a place existed or if God was involved. She replied that God created people with equal dignity and endless love. If everything is right, then everyone will be equal. Isaac thoughtfully said that if there was a God, why were they facing wars here and everywhere in Japan? But he doesn't know whether he believes in God or not in a world of wars where everyone is equal especially. The girl listened attentively and with interest to their philosophical conversation about faith, God, and justice in this cruel world. Zeta told him that at their meeting they said that everything is common and this is the Lord's teaching. Doesn't he understand a way of life where possessiveness would completely disappear forever from human relations? At that moment grandfather turned to her, sternly interrupting their philosophical discussions about religion and the structure of society. The old man angrily said that it was impossible to reason like that out loud. How many times did he have to repeat this to him and to the guy too? If anyone hears their dangerous talk about faith and society, they will definitely be in trouble in the future. Isaac objected that in the Netherlands this is the norm. Grandfather replied that he doesn't know how it is with the Dutch, but here such speeches are accepted. Heretics will be mercilessly burned alive at the stake by the Inquisition without any regard for the intricacies of their religious beliefs and views. Their meeting cannot be spoken of openly, otherwise they may be considered dangerous heretics, which will lead to the death sentence. Farmers should grow crops, blacksmiths should forge iron, and let the mercenary do his direct military work and craft. They are quite different people from the educated lord or the learned pastor, whether they remember it or not. At that very moment Prince Henry suddenly appeared behind them, approaching the group quietly and unnoticed by everyone. The high-born prince approached them at that very moment, attracting the attention of everyone present with his sudden appearance here. The prince politely asked if something serious had happened, and Isaac calmly replied that nothing special was happening. He then reported the important news that they had not received a report from the scout. Alf was still somewhere nearby and the nobles had returned. Isaac asked the prince in surprise if it was possible to act so dishonestly while the prince remained on the battlefield. The prince explained that a knight landowner receives a land in exchange for military service to the royal family, but there is a limit to this. After 60 days, the nobles have the right to leave the army, otherwise their detention will be considered completely illegal coercion. Isaac simply remained silent after this explanation, not knowing what to answer to such feudal laws and orders. The prince was so desperate to find a safe shelter from his enemies that it was noticeable to everyone around him. It is not surprising that he decided to turn to a foreign mercenary for military support despite all the doubts of his courtiers. Although the time will not be long, he will be able to live peacefully, all thanks to the skills and mastery of this shooter. Isaac simply remained silent and did not respond to these words of the prince, thinking about the current military situation in the country. The girl smiled happily and looked at him with admiration at that moment, understanding his importance for their cause. At the same moment, the action moved to a completely different place where no less important events of the war were unfolding. The Spanish prince's luxurious tent was pitched in a safe place away from danger and enemy snipers on the hill. The aristocrat was eating the roasted meat with gusto at this moment, enjoying the delicious food after a stressful day on the battlefield. The Spanish prince clearly enjoyed the juicy meat, trying to forget about the shameful flight and failures in the battle with the enemies. The next moment he asked his faithful assistant Rodrigo to bring him a detailed map of the area for planning. The loyal man politely said that he was now fulfilling his master's orders and would bring all the necessary military maps. After some time, the efficient man brought him a detailed map of the region with all the fortresses and cities on it. The assistant then carefully unfolded and showed him a detailed map pointing out important strategic sites and supply routes. The prince confidently said that the reason why the impregnable castle has still not succumbed to their attacks and siege. This means that he is actively assisted by Rosenheim, a rich and influential free city with its own army. As soon as the regular supplies of food and weapons cease, the castle will certainly be stormed by Spanish troops in the near future. The man began to speak carefully that one must not forget that this is also a fortress, there are few residents there, and capturing the city is problematic. The prince firmly told him to take more experienced people and move towards the city, but he replied that renting an army was expensive. The prince agreed with this fact but recalled the man from Mainz summoned by the siege demon to solve military problems. Rodrigo replied that Spinola's troops had disintegrated after the defeat and that Spain had signed the agreement only with him personally, not the army. Of course, the prince knows this very well. It is impossible to force them to act now, but he has a clever idea. They will use Ambrosio's younger brother to gather and lead soldiers under the name of a general and restore the military contract. The surprised man sincerely said that no one else would have come up with such a brilliant and cunning military plan of action. The prince confidently said that he would personally go to Mainz and give the appropriate order to the influential military commanders of the mercenaries there. Let them prepare for a decisive attack in 3 days. The man respectfully said that as the prince orders, so he will do. The faithful man began to respectfully walk away from his master to carry out the orders he had received and prepare for the offensive. The secret weapon that the prince specifically requested back from distant Bohemia is already on its way to them. This deadly weapon is already in the Palatinate and will arrive here in the very near future for the decisive assault on the city. At the same time, equally important events were unfolding in the besieged fortress, influencing the outcome of the war. A breathless man ran up to the defenders of the fortress and excitedly said that this was an urgent message from the enemy with an ultimatum. Prince Henry was very much surprised by the sudden appearance of a messenger with a message at such a tense time for them. He replied seriously that an official message had been sent from Rosenheim with a direct threat to the inhabitants of the city and its defenders. The prince began to read this important message out loud carefully, so that everyone present could hear the content of the enemy's ultimatum. The message stated that this was a demand of the city council residents must calmly leave the city within 2 days. All the defenders present were very surprised and outraged by the insolence of the enemy, who demanded surrender without a fight. At the same time, residents are strictly prohibited from taking food and weapons with them. They must leave empty-handed. Isaac and the girl also listened attentively to this message, understanding the seriousness of the critical situation that had arisen for the city. The prince continued to read that if they refused, then they should expect an attack in 3 days. The expeditionary army would not take hostages. The men present were furious that the enemy was so brazenly threatening to kill every single person in the city. If the inhabitants become Catholics and join the assault on Wolfsburg, the Spaniards will not touch them and will leave them alive. All the mighty servants of the Spanish king, and the loyal knights of the great commander Ambrosio Spinola demand complete submission from the townspeople. Everyone started talking excitedly about how Isaac had definitely shot Spinola in front of their eyes. Everyone had seen it. This means that either that time or this one they are dealing with a fake double of the real Spanish commander. If Rosenheim falls, there won't be enough food and gunpowder. They have families there. They can't just wait for the inhabitants to be killed. If a double writes to them, then the real Spinola will never be killed, and that's the end of it. The problem is solved forever. And if a real commander writes, then they will act just as cruelly as they always do with rebellious cities. It turns out that there is no fundamental difference between a real and a fake commander for the fate of the city and its inhabitants. Isaac simply stood silently in this tense moment, thinking about the critical situation that had developed and the possible courses of action for the defenders. The next moment, he suddenly pulled out a sharp knife from its sheath, drawing the attention of everyone present to his actions. The prince immediately understood what exactly this mysterious mercenary had planned to do at such a critical moment for all of them. The protagonist began to literally cut the stitches on his injured arm, opening up old wounds with a sharp knife blade. After this painful process, he finally completed the procedure, freeing his arm from the bandages and stitches that restricted movement. Everyone present looked at him at that moment with amazement and bewilderment, not understanding the meaning of his actions. The frightened girl was very scared by the sight of blood and the fact that he was hurting himself for an unknown purpose. Isaac completed the painful procedure within seconds, checking his arm's mobility and readiness to fire the weapon. He confidently replied that it was an excellent opportunity to test how well his hand moved in combat. Prince Henry stated firmly that the mayor knew full well that they would never leave the city empty and defenseless, so he insisted that he command all its defenders and warriors. The prince asked with curiosity and some alarm in his voice whether Isaac really intended to go with him on this dangerous undertaking. The guy, with complete confidence and determination in his voice, replied that he would definitely go with him and share all the upcoming difficulties. Ryazan Andrei patiently explained to everyone present that his uncle would certainly gather all the people and would independently defend the fortified city from enemies. After some time, after completing all the necessary preparations and gatherings for the journey, they were finally ready to set off. They all set out in an orderly manner, just as the wise Prince Henry had previously planned and suggested. The entire group of travelers followed their leader in a friendly and harmonious manner, following his clear directions and instructions along the chosen route. This rather large group of travelers also had hardy and strong camels for transport and assistance to carry goods. At that very moment, one of the men in the group suddenly pointed his index finger into the distance, attracting the attention of all the other members of the expedition. They all simultaneously saw that some unknown figure was slowly but surely moving towards them along the dusty road. The person approaching them turned out to be an elderly middle-aged man wearing a characteristic wide-brimmed hat that protected him from the sun's rays. The unknown traveler gradually began to approach their small group, clearly intending to engage in some kind of conversation or communication with them. Isaac looked with special attention and some caution at the stranger approaching them, trying to guess his intentions. After this, the elderly man in the hat politely and with due respect greeted the noble Prince Henry, bowing his head in a sign of respect. The prince kindly explained to the protagonist that before them stood the respected mayor of the city of Rosenheim named Wagner, an influential and wise man. After meeting the mayor, the prince also politely and appropriately introduced his companion, the main character of this amazing story, to Wagner. The man said in a friendly manner that they should move forward along the road, as he would be happy to show them the right way to the city. The entire group of travelers began to enter in an organized manner through the massive gates into a well-fortified and impressive fortress surrounded by high stone walls. All members of the expedition moved carefully along the wide stone bridge, which led directly to the main gates of the impregnable fortress. Isaac, with great interest and curiosity, began to carefully examine the architecture surrounding him and all the details of the fortification around him. Meanwhile, inside the well-fortified fortress, a very special atmosphere of celebration and solemn anticipation of the arrival of important guests reigned. In the spacious courtyard of the fortress, a great many smartly dressed girls and men gathered, eagerly greeting the arriving travelers. The locals even presented Prince Henry with beautiful fresh flowers as a token of their gratitude and respect. With great joy and respect, the main character simply stood silently to the side and carefully watched the colorful and solemn performance happening around him. Then something special in the crowd of people greeting him caught his attention, and he began to peer intently into the faces of the assembled people. All local residents without exception were sincerely glad to see the arriving guests and expressed their joy openly and directly. One of the young girls in the crowd noticed with curiosity that the main character had a rather strange and unusual outfit. She also noticed his long weapon and wondered with interest where he could have come from. Isaac calmly continued his measured movement forward along the cobblestones, not paying much attention to the whispers and glances of those around him. All the elegant ladies on the carved stone balconies of the buildings waved their hands joyfully and welcomingly greeting the arriving travelers. Meanwhile, next to the meat counter at the city market, ordinary trading life was in full swing with its daily bustle. Along the main shopping street there were many different shop stalls and workshops with a wide variety of goods and services. At the same time, in one of these establishments several women were washing linen and various things in large wooden troughs. Soon all the participants of the solemn procession gathered in the spacious main square of the city, where a fairly large crowd of townspeople was already waiting for them. Mayor Wagner solemnly began to introduce the arriving prince to the assembled crowd of citizens, telling about his noble origins and merits. After this, he continued his speech, introducing the prince in detail and telling about the purpose of his visit to their city. All the assembled townspeople began to shout loudly in unison, expressing their joy and approval at the arrival of such a distinguished guest. People began to shout enthusiastically that together with the prince they would definitely defend their hometown and defeat the Spanish army. The prince raised his hand up and said loudly that all the inhabitants should believe him, as they would fight together for the safety of the city. Naturally, all the citizens present fully agreed with his words and expressed their readiness for a joint struggle. All the people gathered together began to loudly and enthusiastically chant the prince's name, expressing their respect and support for him. Isaac watched everything that was happening in the square, carefully standing on the stone balcony of one of the surrounding buildings. After the completion of the solemn ceremony on the square, he calmly went off in an unknown direction, apparently having some plans of his own. Stopping in a secluded place, he carefully began to aim his long gun at a certain point. Those around him had no idea where exactly and why he was aiming his weapon so carefully and with such concentration. Meanwhile, grandfather and Zeta finally reached the outskirts of the city in their cart after a long and tiring journey. The old man said with bewilderment that he could not understand why Isaac needed this city of Rosenheim at all. The girl patiently replied that Isaac still had not learned how to use his gun properly, without her constant help and support. After this frank explanation, the grandfather immediately fell silent, apparently realizing the seriousness of the situation and the importance of the girl's presence. At that moment, something unusual on the road ahead caught his attention, and he peered closely at the approaching figures. He suddenly saw that right in front of their cart on the road there was a group of armed men in combat gear. The people approaching them turned out to be some kind of knights in shining armor, armed with swords and spears for fighting. Grandfather calmly told Zeta that they should pull off the main road and let these armed horsemen pass. The armored knights let their cart pass without further ado, continuing on their way along the main road to the city. Zeta began to look closely at the armored warriors passing by them with great curiosity and interest. At that moment, among the knights, she suddenly saw a strange man who was very different from the others. This man was wearing a mysterious black mask and was looking straight at her with some special, almost devilish smile. The young girl was very surprised and even a little frightened by this unexpected and intent gaze of the stranger. After that short but tense moment, they simply continued on their way calmly without looking back. At that very moment, the mysterious man's silver cross on a thin chain suddenly popped out from under his clothes. Grandfather and Zeta continued to move forward calmly along the dusty road leading to the city gates of Rosenheim. The girl still turned back with concern and looked attentively at the retreating group of knights in shining armor. She suddenly realized with surprise that the strange man in the mask had very familiar eyes that she had seen somewhere. But the problem was that the knights were already too far away from them to see the details. By this time, a calm evening had already set in, and the sun was slowly disappearing behind the horizon, painting the sky in red tones. This mysterious masked man arrived just in time at the Spanish prince's camp, where his arrival was already awaited. The Spanish prince asked the newcomer with interest and some suspicion how exactly he would introduce himself and give his name. The stranger looked calmly at the prince, assessing his appearance and trying to understand the character of this influential person. After a short pause, he politely introduced himself to the assembled group as Lorenzo without revealing details about his origins or past. Rodrigo curiously asked Lorenzo to show his personal weapon to His Highness for inspection and evaluation of its quality. At that moment, the man carefully began to take his weapon out of its sheath, demonstrating it to the prince and those around him. After this, he respectfully handed his weapon to the prince for a more detailed inspection and study of its features and characteristics. This unusual weapon was exactly like the one that the main character of this amazing story had with him. The Spanish prince began to examine the weapons presented to him with great interest and knowledge, studying every detail. After careful examination, he realized that the weapon was engraved with some symbol from the East that had a special meaning. The prince then asked Lorenzo with curiosity what exactly this mysterious oriental symbol on the blade of the weapon meant. The man calmly replied that this ancient symbol signified fidelity to truth and loyalty in the face of any life trials. He added that people with such principles are not afraid even of death in battle for a just cause. The prince with great interest asked the stranger to explain in more detail the philosophy and meaning of this mysterious Eastern symbol. Lorenzo said seriously that he believed only in the power of this weapon and did not rely on anything else. The Spanish prince was clearly frightened and disturbed by such strange words and philosophy of this mysterious man in a mask. Meanwhile, in the well-fortified fortress of Rosenheim, ordinary life continued with its daily worries and affairs. After wandering around the fortress for a long time, Isaac finally reached the place he needed and stopped in front of an important goal. The young man stopped resolutely right in front of the massive wooden doors leading to some important room or building. Zeta was outside the fortress walls, shouting loudly at him, insistently telling him to come to her immediately for an important conversation. The girl happily said that she had finally received and read his important letter or message which she had been waiting for a long time. Isaac looked at the girl with surprise and some bewilderment, trying to understand the essence of her excitement and appeals. The young man asked the girl curiously why they were there at this particular moment in time. Zeta patiently replied that they would not be able to enter the city through the main gate, so they were forced to spend the night outside. Even from a distance, it was clear to see how they were making a bright fire for cooking and warmth at night. Grandfather looked at Isaac with understanding and sympathy, waiting for his decision on the group's further actions. Isaac responded with concern that Wolfsburg was currently relatively safe, but Rosenheim was under serious threat of attack. The older man nodded understandingly and replied that he had said exactly the same thing about the current military situation. The girl began to ask with concern whether it was true that he could not hold the gun without her constant help. The protagonist looked at her thoughtfully, pondering her words and trying to find the right answer to the question. After this short conversation, all three set off in an unknown direction, having some specific plans and goals. Zeta observed the daily life of the people inside the well-fortified Rosenheim fortress with great interest and curiosity. The young girl was very surprised by the friendliness and hospitality that the locals showed to the visitors. All the local girls greeted the young guy joyfully and warmly, with sincere smiles on their handsome faces. Then Zeta took Isaac by the hand and sternly told him not to look at all those girls. Isaac was very surprised by the girl's jealous reaction and her unexpected demand not to pay attention to those around him. At that moment, she remembered that mysterious man in a black mask whom she unexpectedly saw on the road. Zeta said excitedly that the eyes of the man in the bright cloak she saw yesterday were very similar to Isaac's eyes. The girl wondered whether she should tell Isaac that the stranger might be the man he was looking for. She understood that then he would definitely leave them and go after the head of this mysterious man in a mask. Isaac asked in bewilderment what she was muttering to herself, and the girl told him not to pay attention. Meanwhile, inside the Spanish military camp, the usual atmosphere of preparation for the upcoming military actions and battles reigned. All the military men were busy with their usual daily activities, as always happens in army camps. Then they all turned their attention at once to something important happening at the edge of their military camp. The soldiers saw a richly decorated carriage slowly approaching them, guarded by armed horsemen. The Spanish prince began to impatiently ask his subordinates where the promised Lorenzo was finally located. Rodrigo respectfully reported that reliable information had been received that Lorenzo had already been to Rosenheim and was now on his way here. Meanwhile, in the hospital, wounded and sick soldiers lay on their straw mats awaiting medical attention. A group of healthy male soldiers were at that moment eating their modest military dinner with gusto near the fires. The Spanish prince looked down on all these simple soldiers with disdain from the heights of his noble birth and position in society. At that very moment, someone's heavy-booted foot slowly landed on the ground next to the group of sitting soldiers. Rodrigo loudly began to announce to everyone present that the Crown Prince of Spain himself had arrived to see them, and that everyone should line up immediately. One of the men began to indignantly say that they were not Spanish soldiers but German mercenaries bound only by contract. After these words, the man, frightened and scared, quickly ran away, flashing his heels and not wanting to continue the argument. At that moment, all the other soldiers present instantly fell silent, realizing the seriousness of what was happening and not wanting to incur wrath. The prince explained to those gathered that this was his older brother Federico, the younger brother of the famous commander Spinola, who had become famous in battle. The prince asked in surprise whether this was really so and whether he had correctly understood the information presented to him about the identity of the new arrival. Federico solemnly announced that he was now completely abandoning the name Federico and would go by another name. From now on he will live and fight as Ambrosio Spinola, continuing the glorious traditions of his family. The new Ambrosio Spinola swore that whatever the prince ordered, he would try not to disgrace the honor of his elder brother. He also asked for permission to address the mercenaries personally to raise their morale before the upcoming battles. Ambrosio was confident that when he spoke to the soldiers, they would undoubtedly fight with even greater zeal. The Spanish prince listened attentively to the proposal and responded approvingly that this was exactly what Ambrosio should do for the good of the common cause. After receiving permission, Ambrosio set off in a certain direction with a clear plan of action. All the soldiers and officers present watched his confident movements with great interest and curiosity. Ambrosio solemnly said that one of the boys should accept as a gift a new high-quality weapon from the Spanish crown. He mentioned the famous Leon the Royal of Bohemia, who became famous for his exploits in numerous battles with enemies. Rumor has it that their new recruit has made it into the fortress and can now shoot across the moat while inside the fortification. The prince asked curiously where this talented shooter capable of such accurate shots was now. Ambrosio replied that the shooter had gone on a dangerous reconnaissance mission to the Rosenheim area to gather important information. After this, he announced that the esteemed Prince Alfonso would honor all those present with his solemn speech before the battle. Ambrosio called upon all the soldiers to show due respect to His Highness and to listen carefully to his important words. All the assembled mercenaries and soldiers listened attentively and respectfully to the speech of their commander. The prince solemnly announced for all to hear, "The Spanish crown officially renews the contract with Spinola and orders him to attack the fortress." One of the men present asked with concern whether this dangerous military operation would be carried out completely without payment. The second soldier firmly stated that they would categorically not work for empty, useless promises without real material compensation. Ambrosio stood up decisively and sternly told everyone present not to dare interrupt His Highness's speech. At the same moment, he made a certain sign with his hand to one of his trusted assistants. The man nodded in understanding and also gave a return sign showing that he understood the instructions he had received and was ready to act. After these signals, the richly decorated carriage slowly began to approach the group of assembled soldiers and officers. At that very moment, right before the surprised eyes of everyone present, something interesting and unexpected appeared from the carriage. The people from the carriage began to actively disassemble and take out numerous heavy bags with some contents of unknown purpose. Judging by the quantity, there were enough of these mysterious bags to satisfy the needs of an entire army of mercenaries. The Spanish prince himself was very surprised by what was happening and did not expect to see such a quantity of supplies or treasures. Ambrosio proudly explained that these were taxes collected from captured Dutch cities during successful military campaigns. Then he began to demonstratively pour out shiny gold and silver coins from bags in front of the astonished soldiers. All the mercenaries present were very surprised and delighted when they saw such a quantity of real money. Ambrosio solemnly explained that thanks to the honesty of His Highness, the belated payment for the service would be made from these savings. The prince asked in bewilderment whether all this money was supposed to go to Spain and why it was here. Ambrosio respectfully replied that he himself had just learned of the order to deliver these coins here. The Spanish prince looked at his subordinate with suspicion, trying to understand the true motives of his actions. Ambrosio also looked at the prince calmly and openly, demonstrating his honesty and devotion to the royal family. The prince asked directly if this was really the work of Ambrosio, to which he replied that he was afraid it was. Ambrosio patiently explained that the sea routes for delivering money to Spain had been cut off by the English fleet, which was why payment to the troops was being delayed. He anxiously asked the prince to confirm that he was telling the truth about the difficult military situation that had developed. The prince understood everything and immediately agreed that, of course, the damned English fleet blocking the sea routes was to blame for everything. Ambrosio admitted that his brother controlled the army through charisma, but he prefers to use the greed of the mercenaries to achieve his goals. He solemnly announced that this was only a small part of what the crown provided them, and that they were also allowed to plunder Rosenheim for 3 days after its capture. The Spanish prince himself was very surprised when he heard such generous conditions for ordinary mercenaries and soldiers. All the people in the camp were naturally sincerely grateful for such unexpected generosity and the opportunity to get rich after the victory. Ambrosio knew perfectly well that there was nothing more pleasant than full pockets as opposed to a joyless battlefield, so let them fight. In his opinion, a battle without plunder is like a wedding without a bride, because the soldiers want to take all the gold and women. Ambrosio asked rhetorically why they thought people became mercenaries, of course, to smash and plunder cities. At that moment, Ambrosio resolutely ordered everyone present to immediately shut up and listen to him attentively. All the soldiers and officers instantly fell silent, understanding the seriousness of the moment and the importance of the commander's upcoming words. The Spanish prince began to listen attentively and with great interest to the speech of his experienced military advisor. The prince also noticed that Ambrosio had changed noticeably since their last meeting, becoming more confident and decisive. Ambrosio then officially announced that the army would advance to the city in 4 days, and that they should use the money to restore their spirits. All the soldiers shouted in unison, "Long live Ambrosio Spinola," expressing their support and readiness to follow him. Meanwhile, in the besieged city of Rosenheim, ordinary peaceful life continued, unaware of the impending threat. Isaac, the girl, and the grandfather, after a long search, finally reached the place they needed in the city center. Who would have thought that they would be able to buy so much quality flour for making bread and other essential products? It is from this fresh flour that local bakers will be able to make excellent sourdough for baking bread for all residents. At this important moment, Isaac suddenly turned his attention to a large gathering of excited people near the main city gate. Isaac turned to the prince with concern, asking what exactly was going on at the gate. The prince reported gloomily that unknown assailants had brutally murdered 2 loyal guards who were guarding the city's main gates from enemies. No one saw anything suspicious in the money or valuables, which further increased the mystery of the brutal murder of the guards. The protagonist and the prince looked thoughtfully and attentively at this tragic scene of the crime, trying to understand the motives of the crime. The prince sternly told them all to be especially vigilant and careful with these treacherous scoundrels capable of vile murder. After examining the crime scene, they decided to continue their journey further along the narrow streets of the ancient city. The girl curiously asked where exactly the prince was spending the night, and the main character replied that he was staying with the respected local mayor. However, Isaac himself and his companions decided to stop here in this cozy place for the night. The girl and her grandfather were very surprised by the main character's unexpected decision to stay in this particular place. Right in front of them, they suddenly saw a small but very cozy and hospitable house with a beautiful garden. Since it was already a quiet evening, they all began busily sorting out their things and preparing for the night. The protagonist carefully began to open the heavy wooden door of the house to check the safety of the premises inside. After this, he slowly and carefully began to enter the house, keeping his hand on the handle of his weapon. Inside the room, a warm fire was still burning brightly, indicating the recent presence of some people. The main character continued to walk slowly forward through the house with increased caution, examining every corner of the room. The blazing fire was still hot enough to indicate that the owners or other occupants of the house had recently left. Then his attention was drawn to something suspicious and unusual in the far corner of the room, which made him wary. At that moment, he immediately remembered the mysterious man in the black mask he had seen earlier. The protagonist instantly threw all his things on the floor and prepared for a possible attack or fight. He quickly grabbed his trusty weapon, preparing to defend himself and his companions from potential danger. Zeta happily started saying that it was a really nice house and she had never been to such a fancy place. The main character began to shout in fear at the girl, so that she would not leave the safe place immediately and stay there. It was at this critical moment that Zeta turned her attention to something threatening happening next to her. A man in a black mask suddenly grabbed the unsuspecting girl and held her hostage. The protagonist immediately turned his close attention to the developing extremely dangerous situation with the capture of the girl by the attacker. Just at this tense moment, the masked man grabbed the frightened girl tightly and used her as a human shield. The next moment, the mysterious opponent threateningly swung his sharp blade, preparing to deliver a fatal blow to the hostage. The protagonist stood resolutely right in front of her and pointed the barrel of his loaded gun straight at the enemy. For greater stability and shooting accuracy, the protagonist carefully knelt down on one knee in front of his dangerous opponent. He quickly lit the fuse of his gun, preparing to take a precise shot at the gunman in the black mask. The protagonist loudly and confidently called out the name of his longtime enemy Renzo, showing that he knew his identity. Isaac sternly told Renzo to let go of his weapon immediately, otherwise he would definitely be seriously injured by his shot. But the main character was not going to stop and retreat in the face of this deadly threat to everyone. He called his opponent a vile creature and asked him if he thought he cared about someone's life when he could knock their brains out. The girl was very surprised by such cruel and decisive words from the usually calm main character of this story. Zeta suddenly realized that, strangely enough, this masked man was indeed Isaac's mortal enemy. But what scared her most was the cold and merciless gaze of a guy who was ready to kill to achieve his goal. The masked man mockingly asked if Isaac would change his mind about shooting, risking the life of an innocent girl. At that moment, the main character did not understand where the legendary weapon sin was which he had been looking for so long. By killing this man, he will accomplish his long-awaited revenge, but how can he then find the second sacred weapon without his help? The man in the black mask continued to calmly and confidently look at the main character, waiting for his final decision. Renzo then said with satisfaction that he was grateful to the guy for the fact that Jean and Xing were together again. He offered a deal. Let Isaac give up his musket and then he would immediately release the girl he had captured. The protagonist decisively replied that he would rather shoot the enemy and commit suicide. It would be a million times better. The protagonist was fully prepared to pull the trigger of his gun and end this confrontation once and for all. The man calmly said that he knew everything. If Isaac did not return both weapons, the Shiori clan would kill everyone in their homeland. Isaac was very surprised that this man knew about the secret plans and threats of the Shiori clan. The frightened girl began to desperately scream the main character's name, begging him for help in this critical situation. Zeta asked excitedly what exactly was happening, what would happen to her. Let at least someone explain the situation to her. The main character was still very surprised by the information he received about the clan's plans and the threats to his loved ones. The man in the black mask continued to look at him attentively and calmly, waiting for the final decision on the deal to be made. At this critical moment, Prince Henry suddenly appeared and said that he heard a suspicious noise and shouts. It was at this tense moment that he saw the whole dramatic picture unfolding right before his eyes. Zeta began to worry and panic even more at this critical moment, seeing the emergence of a new person in the confrontation. The protagonist looked at the frightened girl with alarm and concern, assessing the degree of her safety. The masked man quickly glanced at the prince, who had suddenly appeared behind him, assessing the new threat to himself. Prince Henry looked closely at the mysterious man in the black mask, trying to understand who he was. The next moment, the man suddenly jumped out of hiding and began to quickly run away from his pursuers through the forest. Isaac instantly caught the freed girl in his arms, checking to see if the mysterious enemy had harmed her. The man in the black mask continued to run quickly through the dense forest, trying to hide from his pursuers. Prince Henry looked closely at the fleeing man, trying to remember his appearance for future search and pursuit. At that moment, the prince quickly began to take out his own weapon, preparing to pursue the dangerous criminal. The fleeing man even managed to accidentally hit an elderly grandfather at that moment with his rapid flight across the yard. Then the agile fugitive quickly jumped on his prepared horse and prepared for a swift escape from the city. Prince Henry immediately mounted his horse and set off in pursuit of the mysterious criminal. The man in the black mask was fully prepared to quickly escape from here on his fast and hardy horse. During the chase he turned around and looked closely at the noble prince on a white horse pursuing him. Prince Henry was very surprised by who he saw under the black mask during their chase. He was so shocked by what he saw that he was unable to do anything to detain the fugitive. The prince only shouted loudly at the fleeing man at the end, asking him to stop immediately and surrender to the authorities. City guards immediately began an active pursuit of the dangerous criminal who threatened the safety of civilians. But the man, even at full gallop, easily dealt with several of the armed guards pursuing him. After this, the man in the black mask continued to simply calmly run away from the remaining pursuers along the forest road. Prince Henry could only watch helplessly as his enemy retreated from a safe distance from the scene of the skirmish. Meanwhile, in the house where the dramatic fight took place, a heavy atmosphere reigned after the stress everyone had experienced. Isaac knelt silently before his precious weapon, thinking about the events that had taken place and their consequences. Zeta began to cry bitterly and looked at the main character with pain, worrying about him and his condition. She then carefully approached him with understanding and sympathy, trying to provide moral support in a difficult moment. The girl sadly said that he had finally found his old enemy after many years of searching all over the world. Zeta sincerely apologized to him for unwittingly preventing him from completing his important mission of revenge. Isaac simply remained silent and did not answer the girl, immersed in his heavy thoughts about what had happened. After some time, a quiet evening set in, and they all went to inspect the city fortifications and defensive structures. The entire group of people headed to the city walls to assess their condition and readiness for the upcoming defense. Prince Henry asked anxiously if they thought the wall posed a serious danger to the defenders. They all looked carefully at this massive stone wall, assessing its strength and ability to withstand a siege. Isaac, with professional interest, began to carefully examine the fortifications, looking for weak spots in the city's defenses. Prince Henry told Isaac that since Lorenzo was in the enemy army, he would still have a chance to meet him. The girl said with confidence that she was absolutely sure that Isaac would definitely cope with this dangerous opponent. Isaac asked thoughtfully if this meant that his military skills were no worse than those of his old enemy. The prince noticed that the forest was too close and asked if it would be dangerous if the garrison were fired upon from there. He explained that in that case they would not be able to defend the wall and the defense would be broken through, which meant they would have to cut down the trees. Isaac agreed strongly and said that this must be done as quickly as possible before the enemy began a siege. Then the protagonist thought deeply about something important related to the upcoming defense of the city and military tactics. Prince Henry took careful note of Isaac's thoughtful state and his concentration on his plans of defense. Zeta worriedly informed everyone present that the wind had begun to pick up, noticeably foreshadowing bad weather in the coming hours. She reported with concern that judging by all the signs there would definitely be a strong thunderstorm with rain that night. Meanwhile, in the dark, dense forest surrounding the city, events were taking place that could affect the fate of the siege. Someone was definitely there among the trees at this critical moment in preparation for the upcoming battle for the city. It was the same mysterious man in a black mask who hid from his pursuers in the forest thicket. Renzo looked carefully at the illuminated city walls, planning his next moves against the fortress defenders. He reflected that the city would surely fall as soon as he dealt with Isaac in fair combat. After defeating the main character, he will be able to take both sacred weapons and complete his important mission. The mysterious adversary was deep in thought about his plan of attack and the methods of achieving his goal. Renzo knew that it was useless to try to read the wind direction from such a high altitude to shoot accurately. But from his current position in the forest and at such a distance, he would never miss his target. The girl worriedly told the others that they urgently needed to get to a safe place before the storm started. The man in the black mask took careful aim at the main character with his powerful gun at this decisive moment. Isaac peered into the dark forest with professional interest at this critical moment before the attack. Just at this tense moment, the man in ambush fired an accurate shot from his loaded gun. The loud sound of a gunshot echoed throughout the area, breaking the evening silence of the peaceful city. At this critical moment, Isaac immediately turned his attention to the source of the sudden sound of a shot from the forest. The protagonist quickly turned in the direction of the sound, trying to figure out where exactly the shooting came from. The girl and the prince also watched with fear as this sudden and dangerous situation developed. Naturally, the experienced shooter hit the main character, who did not expect a sudden attack from an ambush. Of course, the main character was unable to do anything to protect himself from the unexpected shot from cover in the forest. Isaac could only watch in horror as blood began to ooze from the wound he had received in his body. The next moment, Isaac began to quickly lose consciousness from loss of blood and pain shock from the wound. He began to slowly fall backwards right onto the terrified girl standing behind him, losing his balance from the injury. Isaac then finally fell to the ground, completely unconscious from the serious wound he received from the sniper's shot. Zeta, in desperation, began to beg him not to die and to stay alive. Isaac completely lost consciousness and no longer responded to the voices and calls of the people around him. The girl, in a panic, began calling for help and desperately asking for at least someone to help save the wounded man. A man ran away from the battlefield in terror, not wanting to stay in the dangerous combat zone. Near the site of the battle lay the bloody dead bodies of warriors and defenders of the city who had fallen in battle. But despite the chaos and danger all around, this man decided to continue running forward to safety. The 21st year of the Keicho era had arrived, which corresponds to the year 1615, according to the European calendar. The action took place in May at the famous Osaka Castle, which was the center of important historical events of the time. Isaac, in his memories, paid close attention to someone very important from his past in Japan. In the vision, he began to shout loudly at his longtime enemy Renzo, expressing all the pent-up rage and hatred. At that moment, Renzo slowly turned towards him and looked closely at the main character of this story. The enemy calmly looked straight at Isaac, demonstrating his confidence and readiness for the upcoming confrontation between them. In his strong hands, Renzo confidently held one of the two legendary sacred weapons of the Shiori clan. Isaac firmly told his enemy that he must immediately return to him the sacred weapon called Sin. Renzo mockingly replied that no, it would be better if Isaac himself gave him the second sacred weapon Jin. He explained that if Isaac did not return home with weapons, the enemies would definitely kill the noble Lady Shiori. Renzo added that the conflict in Japan would end with the fall of this castle, and he planned to leave Hirado and head west. Isaac asked in confusion what west meant, and if Renzo was planning to leave, he should leave Shin with him. The enemy mockingly replied that he should not make him laugh, since only with his help could new wars be unleashed. Isaac asked Renzo if he really enjoyed fighting so much and let him look around carefully. The protagonist pointed out the destruction. Here people live amidst blood and gunpowder smoke and can die at any moment. Isaac furiously told his opponent that he should die here and now for all the suffering he had caused. Renzo took careful note of the protagonist's threats and prepared to retaliate against him. The next moment, the enemy quickly began to run away from Isaac, not wanting to continue this dangerous confrontation in the castle. Isaac, at that very critical moment, fired an accurate shot from his loaded musket at the fleeing enemy. The protagonist hit Renzo right in the face, causing him a serious injury that forced him to retreat. Meanwhile, below the castle, a man was slowly sailing along the river in a small wooden boat. At that very moment, a wounded guy with his weapon in his hands suddenly fell onto this boat from above. Renzo immediately fell heavily into the boat, along with his precious sacred weapon bleeding profusely. From the heights of the castle, the main character could only helplessly watch what was happening below by the river. The wounded Renzo, despite the injury he had received, was still looking closely at his opponent at this moment. He took aim with difficulty but still managed to aim his gun at the main character standing on the castle wall. Renzo pointed the barrel of his gun straight at his opponent, preparing to fire back to avenge the injury. He told Isaac with satisfaction that now the sacred weapons belonged again to him alone and not to the enemy. The wounded enemy then began to slowly and with difficulty reload his weapon for the next decisive shot. But at this critical moment, blood was flowing from the wound on his face, preventing him from aiming accurately. It was precisely because of the blood filling his eyes that he could see practically nothing at this important moment for him. But despite the blood and poor visibility, he still decided to shoot at the main character. Renzo hit the protagonist right in the neck, causing him a serious and potentially fatal wound. Despite his own blood pouring into his eyes, the experienced shooter still managed to hit his opponent. The boat with the wounded enemy began to slowly move away from the castle walls along the current of the wide river. Renzo continued to aim with all his might at the protagonist standing on the high wall of the castle. The boat with the wounded shooter moved further and further away from the castle along the fast current of the river. Isaac, with a serious wound in his neck, simply stood motionless in his place on the fortress wall. He began shouting at the enemy again and telling him not to think about dying from his wounds. The boat with Renzo finally found itself very far from the castle and disappeared around the bend of the river. The protagonist began to swear that until he took the sacred weapon Sin from the enemy, he would not calm down. This happened in the year 1615 in April, shortly before the final fall of the famous Osaka castle. At that time, there were several people at a special shooting range testing new weapons. All these people gathered at the firing range clearly to test new models of firearms. Among the testers were Isaac and his faithful companion checking the quality of the manufactured guns. One of the men paid close attention to a man in rich clothes approaching the training ground. He said respectfully that Lord Fujiriho had come to officially inspect the quality of the work done. Another man asked in surprise if an important magistrate had actually come here in person to inspect their work. All over the testing ground, long bamboo canes stuck out of the ground to serve as targets for weapons testing. When the high-ranking man arrived, all the masters and archers present bowed respectfully to him as a sign of respect. He informed the workshop representatives that he had received important news that the weapon ordered by the shogun was already completely ready, but they did not appreciate their diligent efforts. He sincerely thanked the craftsmen for their work and explained that the weapon turned out excellent, although some minor adjustments were necessary since they were currently conducting test firing. He politely asked his escorts to take him to the testing ground as he wanted to personally look in and evaluate the quality of the work done. After a short time, all the necessary preparations were properly organized, and the man was able to observe the testing of the weapon. The experienced man demonstrated excellent shooting technique, demonstrating a high level of proficiency with firearms and accuracy in hitting the target. Two skilled shooters fired their guns, simultaneously demonstrating synchronicity and professional mastery of the workshop's new weapon. Both shooters recovered from the recoil of their weapons equally quickly and confidently, demonstrating excellent training and habits in handling firearms. Amazingly, they also hit their intended targets with equal accuracy, demonstrating not only the skill but also the quality of the weapons they made. After completing the first volley, both shooters methodically began reloading their firearms, preparing for the next stage of testing at the range. After completing the reloading procedure, they once again fired accurately, continuing to demonstrate the stability and reliability of the workshop's new weapon. Amazingly, this time they again hit their targets equally accurately, confirming the highest quality of the manufactured weapons. The observing man closely followed the entire testing process, evaluating every movement of the shooters and the effectiveness of their actions. Experienced shooters continued to methodically fire their guns, demonstrating the consistency of results and the reliability of the new weapons mechanisms. They continued to show excellent hit results without missing a single target during the extended tests. After another series of shots, they began reloading their weapons again and continued shooting tirelessly, maintaining a high pace of testing. The shooters continued to consistently hit their designated targets, demonstrating exceptional consistency in results and the quality of the weapons crafted by the masters. After some time had passed, the observing man expressed admiration and told Sahai that the work done was truly excellent and deserved the highest praise. The respectful man and the two young shooters bowed respectfully to him in gratitude for the high appreciation of their professional efforts. Having completed the inspection and expressed his approval, he calmly began to leave the testing ground, remaining completely satisfied with the quality of the weapons tests. The curious Sahai asked the shooters how they felt about the new guns and what their opinion was about the operation of the mechanisms. One of the experienced shooters replied that the sights needed to be adjusted a little because the bullets were deflecting, and asked Isaac's opinion on this comment. Isaac agreed with his friend's comment and replied that in strong winds it would be really hard to hit the target with the current settings. Sahai asked in surprise, didn't they hit all the designated targets, and how could this weapon be more advanced? The shooter suggested that the Lord take a closer look since no other bullet had ever hit the exact center of the bamboo target on the range. He explained that if the young shooters did not have a natural talent for shooting, they would have missed their targets altogether. Isaac assured that if he was given 2 or 3 days of extra time, he would complete work on a weapon that even an ordinary soldier could use. The man expressed doubt that an ordinary soldier could achieve the same shooting power and accuracy as demonstrated by experienced shooters. Before handing over the finished sample to the customer, the master wants to create the perfect weapon that will put a final end to this protracted war. The customer expected nothing less from him, as he was considered the best gunsmith in the entire city of Sakai and its surroundings. The observing man chose to remain silent and not express his opinion about the master's ambitious plans for the new weapon. Isaac, in exactly the same way, chose to remain silent, not wanting to enter into a discussion about the capabilities and prospects of the weapons they were creating. As evening approached, the dark night gradually descended, enveloping the workshop and the surrounding area in thick shadow and silence. At this late time, inside the spacious workshop building, active work continued on improving and fine-tuning new firearms. Hardworking Isaac was busy with household chores, carrying heavy buckets of water and various materials for the workshop around the building. Suddenly, he noticed Lady Shiori approaching him, heading in his direction with some important message from her father. She politely informed the young man that her respected father asked him to come to him immediately for an important conversation on personal matters. After delivering the message, she carefully closed the doors of the room and calmly left to go about her business, leaving Isaac alone with his thoughts. Isaac immediately came to the master, and he said that he was free to leave the workshop since the working day was coming to an end. The respected man politely asked the young disciple to come closer to him, as he had an important matter to discuss confidentially. After this, he carefully closed the doors of the room to ensure the privacy of the upcoming conversation and to avoid possible eavesdropping by other people. Isaac slowly began to approach his mentor, preparing to listen to the important thing that he wanted to tell him in such a solemn setting. Then the young man respectfully began to sit down in front of the master, adopting a comfortable position for a long conversation about serious life issues. The master solemnly announced that these two superb firearms would be his last and most perfect creations as a gunsmith. With particular care, he began to apply a special symbol to the surface of the weapon, which was supposed to mark the end of his career as a master. The master prophetically said that the war would finally end at the moment when the shogun's troops were fully armed with such perfect examples of firearms. Curious, Isaac asked his mentor how this was possible if these were his last examples and there would be no more production. The experienced man looked at his young student silently and thoughtfully, as if weighing whether to reveal his future plans to him. After a moment of thought, he carefully handed Isaac two finished firearms that represented the pinnacle of his skill and experience. On the surface of both guns, the master skillfully carved special symbols that contained important information about the design and operating principles of the weapon. The man proudly informed the young apprentice that he had carefully carved all the necessary instructions and drawings into the weapon to reproduce them. The protagonist looked closely at the presented weapon, studying every detail of the symbols applied and trying to understand their hidden meaning. The master explained that everything starts from the process of smelting and shaping the barrel and ends with the complex internal mechanisms of starting and reloading the weapon. He added that as long as the Xing and Jin metals needed to produce quality weapons exist, the manufacturing process will be possible. According to the master, any sufficiently skilled craftsman can make this weapon by following the detailed instructions and drawings on it. Isaac thought deeply and slowly lowered his head, contemplating the serious consequences of spreading such a powerful weapon throughout the world. He worriedly told his mentor that if the instructions for making such a weapon were to spread throughout the world, it would inevitably lead to the start of new bloody wars. The wise man simply remained silent and did not respond to his student's concerned words, immersed in his own deep thoughts. After some time, he silently began to prepare something, taking out the necessary materials for the final processing of the finished weapon with special compounds. After preparing the protective composition, the master began to carefully apply it to the surface of the weapon, covering all the details and applied symbols. While the coating was being applied, he began giving verbal explanations and instructions, supplementing the information carved into the surface of the weapon. The master explained that he would cover the finished weapon with a special protective varnish, which would protect the metal from corrosion and preserve the clarity of the symbols. He added that if the owner carefully cleaned the weapon, all the characters would remain visible, but this knowledge should only be available to those rulers who sought peace. Isaac watched his mentor's actions silently and attentively, absorbing his every movement and word as he completed the final processing of the weapon. The wise man then solemnly handed him the fully completed weapon, which was the result of many years of work and accumulated skill. After that, he slowly stood up from his seat and headed to the far corner of the workshop where there was a special cabinet for storing valuable items. With extreme care, he placed the 2 finished firearms in a sturdy wooden cabinet, which was designed to store the master's most important creations. Isaac watched the master's every action carefully and intently, understanding the importance of the moment and trying to remember all the details of the ongoing process. After placing the weapons, the man carefully locked the cabinet with a secure lock, ensuring complete safety for storing his latest and greatest creations. Then he simply stood next to the closed cabinet, deep in thought about the future of his creations and the fate of the workshop. After some time, he sat down next to Isaac and said that he had a very important and personal request for his faithful disciple. The master delicately asked if Isaac would agree to take his daughter Shiori as his wife and continue the glorious line of Shibakusa masters in future generations. Isaac was so surprised by the unexpected proposal that for a few moments he was speechless and could not find the right words to respond. The master reminded that Isaac had come into their family at the age of 6, and now he trusted him more than anyone else in the world. Isaac said he needed time to think as he wanted to continue learning from his mentor and improving his skills. The man asked him in surprise if he hadn't said earlier that he no longer intended to be a gunsmith in the future. The main thing is that he and Shiori can live like ordinary peaceful people, not burdened with the burden of creating weapons of war and destruction. Isaac asked in bewilderment why he was the one who received such an offer, since there was also Renzo, who was also the master's student. The man replied that Renzo was not the type of person who could live peacefully in times of peace, as his nature was too restless and warlike. He explained that he took Renzo as a student solely for the sake of creating the perfect weapon, but did not see him as a worthy successor to the family business. The guy was close to them at that very moment and involuntarily heard the entire conversation between the master and his senior student. The man said that he therefore begged Isaac to accept his offer, but Isaac asked the master to raise his head and not to humiliate himself before him. He replied that he was ready to give the master a day or two for final reflection so that he could make an informed decision on such an important issue. The man gratefully replied that he would definitely give Isaac the necessary time to consider the proposal and make a final decision. After the important conversation was over, they calmly went back to their places, each immersed in thoughts about the future of the workshop and family. At this late moment, Renzo was lying in his bed, thinking about the conversation he had overheard and his situation in the workshop. The young man was deep in thought about something important, analyzing the master's words he had heard and his prospects as a gunsmith's apprentice. Isaac lay in his bed in exactly the same way, lost in thought about the unexpected proposal and its possible consequences. Isaac carefully considered all the information he had received, weighing the pros and cons of accepting the master's offer to marry his daughter. At this quiet time, the street was silent and nothing disturbed the peaceful atmosphere of the night city and the surroundings of the workshop. The young girl was in her cozy room getting ready for bed after an eventful day at her parents' house. She was calmly changing into her night clothes at this late moment, unaware of the important conversation between her father and Isaac. Suddenly she reached under her pillow to get something important that was hidden there for a special occasion. She told Renzo that she had brought him the key to her father's room, which would allow him to access the workshop at night. The girl curiously asked the guy for what purpose he needed this key and what he was going to do in his father's workshop. He replied that he could not stop thinking about the perfect weapon and wanted to touch it again while he was still here. The girl gave him the necessary keys without any unnecessary questions, trusting his intentions and not suspecting the possible consequences of this act. Then she sadly asked if he was really going to leave their house and the workshop forever. Renzo asked her directly if she would like to go on a journey with him and start a new life. The young girl looked at him in surprise and confusion, not expecting such an unexpected offer from her father's student. She then sadly replied that she could not leave her elderly father alone and leave her home for an uncertain future. He simply stood up silently and headed towards the exit of the room without saying a word in response to the girl's refusal. Then he began putting on his shoes in the hallway, preparing for a nighttime foray into the workshop to carry out his secret plans. Renzo headed towards the master's room where the most valuable and advanced firearms created in the workshop were kept. He carefully opened the doors of the room, trying not to make any unnecessary noise that could wake up the inhabitants of the house. The young man began to open the heavy cabinet, using the keys he had received from Shiori, hoping to find the weapon he desired there. When he opened the cabinet, two magnificent firearms appeared before his eyes, representing the pinnacle of gunsmithing. Renzo looked closely at the master's perfect creations, admiring their beauty and imagining their destructive power in battle. After a short contemplation, he took both weapons in his hands and began to carefully exit the workshop with the intention of leaving this place forever. At this critical moment, one of the residents of the house approached him, noticing suspicious activity at night. The voice began to persistently ask him why he needed a weapon at such a late hour and what he was going to do with it. Renzo immediately began trying to hide the weapon, realizing that his secret plans could be discovered and thwarted by the other inhabitants of the house. At this tense moment, an alarmed Isaac jumped out of his room, hearing unusual sounds and voices in the silence of the night. He was extremely surprised to see Renzo holding two valuable firearms that belonged to their mutual master. Isaac let out a meaningful curse as he realized the seriousness of the situation and the possible consequences of his fellow workshop students' actions. The master told Isaac that he had jumped to conclusions too quickly, without understanding the true intentions and motives behind the young Renzo's actions. It was at this critical moment that the boy unexpectedly killed the master, committing an irreparable crime against his mentor and benefactor. Isaac was so shocked by what he saw that, for a few moments, he could not believe in the reality of the nightmare happening before his eyes. The guy didn't care at all about the consequences of his actions, while the master tried in every way to resist the attack and protect his life. The dying master held on to his precious weapon until the last moment, not wanting to give it into the hands of a traitor and murderer. A shocked Isaac began to desperately appeal to the boy, trying to understand the motives of his terrible act and stop further bloodshed. After this, the protagonist tried to make some kind of agreement or treaty with him, hoping to prevent the final tragedy. Renzo looked at him coldly at that tragic moment, showing a complete lack of remorse for the crime he had committed. The dying master continued to hold the weapon in his weakening hands with all his might, not wanting to give it to his killer. The protagonist began to run away in despair, loudly asking Renzo why he committed such a terrible and unforgivable crime against the master. He continued to scream and ask why Renzo killed their mutual mentor, who gave them shelter, knowledge, and the opportunity to master the craft. In this moment of despair, he ran out of the workshop into the street, trying to attract the attention of his neighbors and get help in the current situation. The young girl saw him at this tragic moment and immediately understood from his face that something terrible and irreparable had happened. Isaac didn't respond to her look and simply ran past, unable to stop and explain the misfortune that had happened. Shiori looked at the fleeing Isaac in surprise and fear, sensing the approach of trouble but not understanding its true scale. The terrified boy continued to run away from the crime scene, not knowing what to do in such a desperate and hopeless situation. The young girl remained standing in place, looking at Isaac's figure receding into the distance and sensing the impending tragedy. At this mournful moment, a fine rain began to fall from the sky, as if nature was mourning the tragedy that had occurred in the workshop. The respected master naturally died from his wounds without having time to convey his final instructions and blessings to his beloved students. The shocked girl could not believe that her beloved father had actually died such a tragic and sudden death. All the people who were inside the house at that moment also cried bitterly, mourning the untimely death of the respected master. Someone present asked anxiously whether it was true that the master's precious weapon had been stolen along with the murder. Isaac and the grief-stricken girl looked at the man in surprise, not understanding where he got such information about what happened. At that moment, an unfamiliar man suddenly appeared in front of them, who had an official appearance and serious intentions. It was the same man who had been present at the site during the tests, and now he was persistently approaching them. It was the same customer representative who had been watching the shooting at the range, and now he demanded that the girl answer him honestly. The frightened girl began to apologize to the menacing man, realizing the seriousness of the situation and the possible consequences of what happened in the workshop. He sternly asked her if she thought their family would be enough to carry out the order received from their powerful lord. The official persistently asked who exactly had stolen the precious weapon and where the criminal had gone after committing this daring robbery of the workshop. The protagonist honestly answered the formidable man that this terrible crime was committed by Renzo, who was one of the students of the late master. The man said with concern that if Renzo showed up at Osaka Castle with the stolen musket, it could lead to disastrous consequences. The protagonist, confused, admitted that he did not know what he should do in such a difficult and dangerous situation with a stolen weapon. Isaac asked permission to take the weapons remaining in the workshop, promising that he would kill the traitor Renzo and be sure to return the stolen muskets back. The menacing man began to slowly approach him, assessing the seriousness of the young man's intentions and his ability to fulfill his promise. He said that he would take Isaac at his word, and let him only dare to refuse what he had said or not fulfill the promise he had made. The man sternly warned that Isaac must return the weapon since he had no right to make a mistake in this matter. He ordered that Isaac be provided with suitable clothing and equipment as he would be going in search of an enemy shooter with a stolen weapon. The protagonist gratefully thanked the government representative for the opportunity to correct the situation and restore the honor of the workshop. The man coldly said that there was no need to thank him prematurely, and ordered the servants to collect everything Isaac needed for the journey. The main character could not understand the true meaning of these words and the hidden threat they carried. The government official explained that if Isaac returned without completing the order, Sahai's daughter would be immediately executed by order of the Lord. They were both so surprised and shocked by this threat that for a few moments they lost the ability to speak. After making the threat, the man simply turned around and began to calmly walk away, leaving behind an atmosphere of fear and despair. At this point, the servants began to tell the girl not to twitch and not to try to resist what was happening to her. Shiori cried and desperately called out to Isaac at that tragic moment, begging him not to leave her in such a hopeless situation. She apologized to him and said that she had been a foolish woman for entrusting the keys to Renzo and thus contributing to the tragedy that had occurred. The girl continued to apologize until the last moment, until she was taken away from the workshop to be executed in case of Isaac's failure. Isaac was in a state of rage at this tragic moment, realizing the full weight of responsibility that fell on his shoulders. Someone said that it was too dark and nothing could be seen when the main character suddenly woke up from a disturbing dream. It was Caring Zeta who persistently called him by name, trying to bring him out of his restless sleep and nightmarish visions. She exclaimed that thank God he had finally opened his eyes and returned to the world of the living after a long period of unconsciousness. The girl cried with relief and sincerely prayed to God, thanking him for saving the life of the person dear to her. Prince Eric immediately burst into the room and began asking worriedly where exactly it hurt and how the wounded man was feeling. The doctor replied reassuringly that the bones and muscles of the shoulder had not suffered any serious damage despite the severity of the injury. The bullet entered in one place and exited under the collarbone, which was a real miracle considering the proximity of vital organs. The relieved girl said that it was truly incredible happiness and luck that everything went without serious health consequences. The protagonist tried to say something to those present, but his voice sounded too quiet and unintelligible due to weakness. The caring girl moved much closer to him in order to better hear the important thing he wanted to tell them. He asks in a weak voice when he will be able to pick up a gun again and return to active shooting. Prince Henry sternly said that he had been shot only recently, and that he should not rush things but first allow the wounds to heal completely. The protagonist silently and thoughtfully looked at the prince, understanding the truth of his words, but internally striving for a speedy return to duty. At this calm moment, everyone present heard a loud and sharp shot coming from somewhere in the street. The protagonist immediately paid close attention to the characteristic sound and tried to determine the source of the shot by its features. He confidently said that this characteristic sound comes from a weapon made by Master Lorenzo and having special acoustics. At this tragic moment, an innocent woman was killed on the street, the victim of an enemy sniper. All the people nearby watched this tragedy in horror, unable to do anything to prevent the disaster. The little girl screamed and cried with grief because her own mother was killed before her eyes, and the man stopped the child so that she would not get hit by a bullet. They were shooting from afar, and the city's defenders did not even see who exactly was firing at civilians from cover. Prince Henry immediately arrived at the scene of the tragedy to assess the situation and take the necessary measures to protect the townspeople. The man reported to the prince that a woman and child from a family of farmers from the outskirts of the city had fled here, but the mother had been shot right in front of her daughter. Prince Henry looked with deep understanding and compassion at the crying girl orphaned by enemy shelling. Then he looked sadly at the body of the murdered woman, realizing the tragedy of the situation and his responsibility for the safety of his subjects. He ordered that no one should wait until dark, as the enemy would shoot anyone who tried to leave or go out of the besieged city. Then someone present noticed something suspicious happening in the upper part of the city's fortifications. They all looked up at once to see what had caught the attention of one of the observers. At that moment, a seriously wounded or killed guard fell from the fortress wall above, becoming the victim of an enemy sniper. All those present were frightened and very surprised by the suddenness of the attack and the accuracy of the enemy's shooting. Prince Henry looked grimly at the body of the fallen guard at that tragic moment, assessing the seriousness of the threat to the city. He spoke with concern that Isaac was not yet able to hold a weapon and participate in the defense of the city from enemy snipers. The Spaniards have an equally skilled shooter in reserve, and the city's defenders will not be able to give a worthy rebuff to the enemy now. The prince ordered the garrison to be informed that everyone should watch from cover and not fall into the enemy's field of vision, avoiding open spaces. It was a busy road from Rosenheim to Hessen via the town of Rabendorf, along which travelers were constantly moving. At that time, there were many different people there, including merchants, artisans, pilgrims, and other business travelers. Of course, there were also numerous merchants present offering their goods and services to passers-by and local residents. They sold various goods and, strangely enough, continued to trade even during this alarming moment of military action. Among the crowd there were a couple of suspicious people who were carefully watching what was happening and listening to the conversations. A curious man asked those around him if it was true what he was told about General Spinola's forces surrounding Rosenheim. The wandering clown said that he wanted to make some money in the town square, but was stopped by soldiers who boasted that they stood with the Spaniards as mercenaries under the command of a famous commander. According to eyewitnesses, the mighty Spinola should not have survived the final battles but somehow escaped death. The clown had recently traveled to a neighboring town on business and overheard that the Spaniards were planning a major attack on the enemy's fortified positions. Prince Henry had gone to the besieged fortress 2 or 3 days before to personally lead the defense of the city against the advancing Spanish troops. The interlocutor was very surprised when he heard reliable information about Prince Henry and his participation in the defense of the besieged city. At the same time, an important meeting was taking place in the military camp of an influential Spanish prince to plan further military operations. Loyal guards reliably protected his spacious tent from possible spies and saboteurs who could penetrate the troop location. The young man insistently told them to surround the enemy fortress at a great distance and make sure that no one could enter or leave it. Eventually, the city's defenders will not be able to withstand a long siege and will be forced to surrender to the mercy of the victor without unnecessary bloodshed. One of the military leaders present respectfully addressed the young man, wishing to express his opinion on the proposed siege plan. When he addressed him as an elder brother, he sharply replied that Ambrosio and his elder brother had died in a recent battle. The prince sternly said that the commander should remember this well and never again mention the names of the dead without special need. The besieged city probably knows about the siege that has begun and will actively stock up on food and military equipment for a long-term defense. All the commanders present looked attentively at the prince, awaiting further instructions regarding the conduct of the siege works and the assault on the fortress. The military leaders really thought seriously about his wise words and began to consider possible options for the development of events during the siege of the city. The prince impatiently asked the commander if Roberto really did not understand the complexity of the current military situation and its peculiarities. He explained that right now only one skilled marksman was keeping the entire city under his sights and controlling the movements of the defenders. The prince added that if someone poked their head out from behind cover, the sniper would immediately hit the target with an accurate shot. Fear among the civilians of the besieged city is growing day by day, undermining the morale of the defenders and their readiness to resist. Soon they will look for any chance and agree to enter into negotiations for a temporary truce with the Spanish troops besieging them. But of course this truce will be false and will only serve to deceive the enemy and prepare a decisive blow. All the commanders present listened attentively to the prince's wise speeches, understanding the importance of his every word for the success of the upcoming operation. The experienced mercenaries in this army have captured many castles in the past using similar clever tricks and military stratagems. The prince asked if the commander knew exactly how this operation should be carried out in this particular situation with a besieged city. He pointed out a weak spot as this part of the fortress wall lacks a protective roof, making the defense less effective. Their infantry can climb up under the cover of fire from crossbowmen and musketeers who will suppress the resistance of the defenders on the walls. The young man said that he gave his full consent to the proposed assault plan and was ready to participate in its implementation. All the military leaders present were very surprised by such a quick and decisive response from a young and inexperienced commander. The older man looked at him sternly and disapprovingly, clearly not sharing his enthusiasm for the upcoming military action. After this, the dissatisfied commander began to leave the spacious tent, demonstrating his disagreement with the decision taken to immediately storm. He then mounted his war horse, preparing to ride out to his troops to prepare for the coming battle. He angrily said that he would be damned if he allowed the young prince to blacken the glorious name of the commander with his dirty tricks and dishonest methods. The boy asked Antonio to convey an important message to a man from the east who was carrying out a special mission in this military operation. The message stated that he was strictly forbidden to shoot while the noble Roberto Diaz was in open combat with the enemy. At this point, the prince turned to the experienced general with an important question about the possibility of successfully completing the siege of the city. He asked the commander whether the valiant Diaz could capture the fortified city with an army of only 500 select soldiers. The general replied that the enemy archer was wounded and could not act yet, but even if Lorenzo did not participate, the battle would still break out between the knightly squads. These arrogant youths want Diaz to win, but victory or defeat is of no decisive importance in the long run of the war. But the era of chivalry and heroic legends is finally over, and it is time for the young prince to clearly understand and accept this. Now military campaigns will begin with hope and desperate attempts to achieve a quick victory at any cost. The experienced general began to tell them in detail his cunning plan to capture the city and destroy its defenders. And all military undertakings will end with horror, betrayal, and disappointment in the ideals of knightly honor and nobility. All the commanders present looked at the general in surprise, struck by the cynicism of his words and gloomy predictions about the future of the war. Then they all looked closely at the miniature statue of the fortress, which served as a visual aid for planning the assault. At the same time, in the besieged fortress, the defenders were preparing for the decisive battle for the freedom of their hometown. The lookout shouted loudly that enemy troops were approaching and preparing to storm the fortress walls in the near future. All the defenders of the city immediately paid close attention to the alarming message and began to prepare to repel the attack. The enemy army was indeed approaching closer and closer to the city walls, carrying with them siege weapons and assault equipment. The attackers carried with them long siege ladders, which were supposed to help them overcome the high walls of the fortress. Armored knights were also among the attackers, ready to be the first to scale the walls and break the resistance of the defenders. The defensive commander shouted for all defenders to take up their positions and prepare to repel the first wave of the assault. After this, they raised their weapons and prepared for battle, ready to defend their hometown to the last drop of blood. The defenders of the fortress began to methodically shoot from bows and crossbows, trying to stop the approaching enemies at distant approaches. The attackers continued to stubbornly carry the heavy ladders closer and closer to the walls despite intense shelling from the defenders. The long-awaited battle for the city had begun, and the fate of all its inhabitants now depended on the bravery and courage of the defenders. The Spanish troops began to break into the fortress decisively, using all means available to them to overcome the fortifications. Then the enemy soldiers began to climb en masse up the ladders, trying to reach the top of the fortress walls as quickly as possible. Naturally, the defenders met them with intense return fire from all types of weapons at their disposal. The people in the fortress began to defend themselves fiercely in every possible way, using every opportunity to inflict damage on the advancing enemy. A fierce battle unfolded precisely in that part of the wall that was practically defenseless due to the lack of additional fortifications. Prince Henry moved quickly around the fortress at this critical moment, coordinating the actions of the defenders in different areas of the defense. As he had expected, the enemy was not planning to attack the part of the wall where the skilled marksman Isaac had been shot earlier. The main character woke up from oblivion at this tense moment, and the caring girl carefully observed his condition. The protagonist told the girl in a weak voice that he had had enough of lying in bed, and it was time to return to active action. Then he slowly began to rise from the bed despite the pain in his injured shoulder and the protests of the girl caring for him. The main character went to the window and looked at the fierce battle unfolding between the defenders and attackers under the walls of the fortress. Seeing the battle taking place, he immediately began to gather his strength, realizing that his help was urgently needed by his comrades in arms. The young man began to dress hastily, ignoring the pain in his shoulder and the girl's admonitions to stay in bed. The protagonist said with regret that he could move his right hand but not his entire arm due to the injury he received. Then he resolutely took up his faithful sword, which had been his constant companion in many battles and dangerous adventures. The protagonist began to take his weapon out of its sheath, checking its readiness for the upcoming battle with enemy soldiers. He demonstratively pulled out a shiny blade, showing the girl his readiness to participate in the battle despite his injury. The alarmed girl began to scream at him, desperately trying to convince him not to participate in the battle in such a grave condition. She asked him anxiously what he was doing since he couldn't fight in such a weakened state after being seriously wounded. The protagonist confidently replied that Lorenzo was within easy reach, and even though he wouldn't be able to hold a weapon with both hands, he could still fight. Poor Zeta began to cry after his decisive words, realizing that she could not stop him from participating in the dangerous battle. Isaac looked closely at the crying girl, seeing her sincere concern for his life and health in the upcoming battle. Without saying anything in response to her tears, he simply turned around and began to resolutely walk away towards the battlefield. The unfortunate girl watched the retreating figure with tears in her eyes, praying for his safety in the coming battle. The fierce battle for the fortress continued at this critical moment, and the outcome of the battle remained uncertain for both sides. The attacking soldiers carried new long ladders to different sections of the fortress wall, trying to find the least protected places. The enemy soldiers continued to stubbornly climb the walls of the fortress despite intense fire from the defenders and heavy losses in their ranks. Crossbows were also actively present in this bloody battle, causing serious damage to both attackers and defenders. Many people on both sides died in the first minutes of the fierce battle, staining the ground under the walls with blood. It was a truly brutal and merciless battle in which there was no room for showing mercy to the enemy. Prince Henry was present on the battlefield throughout this time, personally leading the defense and inspiring his soldiers to heroic deeds. Isaac appeared at this moment next to the prince and said that the number of soldiers was becoming fewer due to losses in the battle. Prince Henry asked in surprise what he was doing there, since only 3 days had passed since he had been seriously wounded. Isaac confidently replied that he was quite capable of fighting with his left hand and would be useful in this critical situation. Prince Henry looked at his wounded comrade with concern, assessing his real ability to participate in a fierce battle. The bloody battle continued with the same intensity, and both sides suffered heavy losses in manpower and equipment. Isaac noticed that everyone was too afraid of the sniper Lorenzo and did not dare to climb the walls for active defense. This was indeed their main problem in this situation, since most of the defenders preferred to hide from the enemy sniper. This garrison turned out to be too inexperienced and green in contrast to the battle-hardened soldiers of the Wolfsburg regiment. If the prince had a group of 200 or 300 experienced veterans, they would have easily repelled the attackers in this part. But to his great regret, he did not have these battle-hardened troops at his disposal for an effective defense. The city's defenders tried in every way to resist the advancing enemy, using all the means and opportunities available to them. When Prince Henry noticed that Isaac was starting to draw his weapon, he warned him not to look out, otherwise he would be shot immediately. The fierce battle continued despite everything, and neither side was going to give in to the enemy without serious resistance. The prince said that they had to use the holes in the wall of the defensive structure and stop those who were climbing the ladders at any cost. All the defenders were seriously frightened at this critical moment, seeing so many enemy soldiers breaking through their defenses. Isaac said with alarm that the fortress would certainly fall if the situation continued to develop in such an unfavorable manner. He suggested leaving the fortress and defeating the enemy attack with a decisive flank attack while there was still such an opportunity. Prince Henry asked whether this proposal was not an attempt to get out of a completely hopeless situation by desperate measures. At this critical moment, he gathered around him a small army of the most experienced and brave defenders of the fortress. He said they couldn't sacrifice the safety of the entire city, so only volunteers who were here would participate. At this decisive moment, the drawbridge began to slowly lower, opening the way for a sortie from the besieged fortress. Then the heavy bridge was lowered completely across the moat, giving the defenders an opportunity to counterattack the besiegers. Prince Henry shouted loudly to his warriors that the moment had come when he would advance to the decisive attack against the enemy. At this heroic moment, all the volunteers rushed out of the fortress ready to fight for the freedom of their hometown. The Spanish commanders shouted to their soldiers to pay immediate attention to the unexpected sortie from the fortress. Prince Henry and his small army moved resolutely straight towards them, ready to accept an unequal battle with superior enemy forces. All enemy forces immediately turned to them, stopping the assault on the walls and concentrating on repelling the counterattack. At this tense moment, the two armies practically collided with each other in the open field in front of the fortress walls. Prince Henry held his battle sword confidently at the ready, preparing for hand-to-hand combat with the enemy warriors. It was at this critical moment that the opposing forces finally clashed with each other in a fierce hand-to-hand fight. Prince Henry and the rest of the city's defenders fought bravely against superior enemy forces, not sparing their lives. Isaac was extremely focused in this dangerous moment, compensating for his limited movement with concentration and combat experience. The bloody battle continued with the same ferocity, and the outcome of the battle remained uncertain for both warring parties. The Spanish commander said that the enemy was retreating for a short time. It was only a small detachment, and they needed to be surrounded at a distance and suppressed. Naturally, all the enemy soldiers began to carry out the order and surround the small detachment of defenders who had left the fortress. Then the Spaniards began to shout loudly that they needed to completely surround the enemy and not let him return to the fortress. Prince Henry began to watch the situation unfold in surprise, realizing that his plan might not work as expected. Isaac said grimly that they were in serious trouble, and the prince was forced to agree with his assessment of the situation. Isaac, puzzled, began to quickly assess the current situation, trying to find a way out of being surrounded by superior enemy forces. Enemy soldiers began to methodically attack them from all sides, tightening the encirclement and cutting off their escape routes. All types of weapons available to the opposing sides were used, from swords to crossbows. Soldiers on both sides died almost instantly from wounds received in battle without having time to receive medical assistance. Flying arrows and crossbow bolts hit the warriors in the head, instantly leaving them no chance of survival. The Spanish commander began to shout to his men not to accidentally hit the prince and the Asian, since their capture meant a corresponding reward. Isaac and Prince Henry stood in the center of events, unsuspecting at this critical moment in the development of the battle. Despite all the difficulties and obstacles, the fierce battle continued with the same intensity and mutual hatred. The Spanish troops continued to methodically attack the surrounded defenders, seeking to end the battle in their favor. Isaac truly fought bravely, with one hand demonstrating outstanding swordsmanship even in his limited condition. The city's defenders were completely surrounded at this critical moment, and their situation became increasingly desperate. Isaac and Prince Henry realized with great sadness at this moment that their desperate plan for a counterattack had failed and had led to an even more dire situation.